They were born beneath crowns that promised glory and delivered ruin. Two daughters of destiny, two branches of the same royal tree, each destined to wear a crown forged in blood. One would command the dawn of a new empire. The other would die beneath the weight of an ancient faith. This is the story of two queens, Elizabeth of England and Mary of Scotland, and the century that bled for them. Welcome to Calm History. The year was 1533, and England trembled beneath the will of its king. Henry VIII, desperate for a son, had torn his realm from Rome and cast aside his queen, Catherine of Aragon, to take another Anne Boleyn, a woman whose wit and charm had bewitched him as completely as any prayer. He waited for a prince who would secure his line and silence his conscience. What he received was a daughter. The infant was named Elizabeth, and from her first cry, she carried the burden of her father's defiance. She was the child of a marriage that had divided Christendom, the living symbol of a king's rebellion. The bells that rang for her baptism were hollow with disappointment. No triumph greeted her cradle, only the uneasy silence of a court that had prayed for a son. Yet in that silence lay something greater than hope, the birth of a survivor. Anne Boleyn, proud and sharp as glass, raised her daughter to be aware, observant, and wary of affection. But power is a jealous god. Within 3 years, the queen who had changed the faith of a nation fell to her husband's suspicion. Accused of treason and adultery, she knelt on the scaffold at the Tower of London in May of 1536. A single sword stroke ended her life and erased her name from the court she had once ruled. That evening, her child ceased to be a princess. Elizabeth, barely 3 years old, was declared illegitimate, an orphan of politics, before she could speak its language. From that day, she learned to hide behind silence. The court became a place of shifting loyalties, and Elizabeth, watched by servants who feared her very existence, learned the art of endurance. She was a Tudor by blood, but something more dangerous by circumstance. A woman destined to outthink her enemies. Alone among courtiers who smiled with daggers in hand, she mastered patience. Every humiliation became instruction. Every kindness, a test. Far to the north, another child's fate was written in the same ink of blood and prophecy. In the winter of 1542, at Linlithgow Palace in Scotland, Mary Stuart entered the world as the only legitimate child of King James V and his French queen, Mary of Guise. Her birth came at a terrible cost. Her father, defeated by the English and broken by fever, muttered a prophecy that would echo through centuries. It came with a lass, and it will go with a lass. Within days, he was dead, and his newborn daughter, barely a week old, was proclaimed Queen of Scots. The cradle became her throne, and from her first breath, Scotland became a battlefield of ambition. Regents ruled in her name, nobles schemed, and foreign powers extended their hands across her borders. The infant queen became a prize between England and France, between Catholic and Protestant, between survival and surrender. The nation that crowned her did so with trembling hands, already knowing it had given birth to both blessing and curse. While Mary's destiny unfolded amid prophecy, Elizabeth's grew in shadows. Henry VIII, ever restless, remarried again and again, 6 queens, 6 fates. Of them all, only Jane Seymour gave him the son he craved. But the cost of that son was her life, and the joy of a male heir faded quickly into paranoia. Elizabeth, the forgotten child, drifted through palaces like a ghost of her mother, her name mentioned only when it served someone's purpose. Yet there were moments of light. Under Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr, Elizabeth found the closest thing to family she would ever know. The queen was wise and kind, encouraging her stepdaughter to study languages, philosophy, and the scriptures. Elizabeth absorbed knowledge as though it were armor. She learned Latin and Greek, mastered Italian, read theology and history until her tutors marveled. In a court ruled by caprice, knowledge became her one unassailable kingdom. She could lose her name, her title, her safety, but never her mind. In France, Mary's childhood took a different shape. At 5 years old, she was sent across the sea for safety, escorted by French ships through cold gray waters. Scotland burned behind her as the English army ravaged its borders, demanding her betrothal to Henry's son. But the Scots chose France instead. Mary arrived in a world of silk and candlelight. Her accent strange to courtiers, who called her La Petite Reine d'Écosse, the Little Queen of Scotland. The French court adored her beauty, her quick wit, her charm. Even as a child, she moved with a grace that seemed to belong to another century. The Dauphin, Francis, was a timid boy, sickly and pale beside her. Yet together they became the living promise of an alliance that stretched beyond politics into destiny, a union of crowns that could encircle England. To the French, Mary was not merely a child, but a key, a living answer to their ancient rivalry across the Channel. Back in England, the child Elizabeth watched her father grow monstrous with age and doubt. The great king who had defied popes now feared his own heirs. His only son, Edward, was frail. His daughters, reminders of past rebellions. When Henry died in 1547, the kingdom he left behind was a quilt of uneasy faiths and wounded loyalties. The Reformation he had unleashed could not be contained, and the fire of belief burned without direction. At 13, Elizabeth stood among the mourners, silent as ever, her expression unreadable. Her father's coffin was draped in black velvet, its gilded edges reflecting candlelight like a fading empire. She knew even then, what others did not, that survival in this world would demand more than lineage. It would demand calculation. The age of kings was ending. The age of queens was beginning. In the first years after Henry's death, England felt less like a kingdom than a wound slowly closing over. His 9-year-old son, Edward VI, inherited both the crown and the turmoil of a divided nation. The court was ruled not by the child, but by ambitious men, uncles, advisors, and soldiers who saw in his youth an opportunity to govern through him. Elizabeth watched from the margins, too young to challenge, too dangerous to ignore. Her mother's ghost still haunted the palaces. Her father's suspicion still clung to her name. The boy king was frail, his faith fierce and fragile, molded by Protestant reformers who spoke of salvation through scripture, not ceremony. Under his reign, monasteries were stripped, Latin hymns silenced, altars torn down and replaced with wooden tables. The faith of England was remade again. And Elizabeth, ever the observer, studied both the passion and the peril of conviction. She understood what few others did. Belief could make or destroy a crown as easily as blood could. At Hatfield in Chelsea, she kept her household modest, surrounding herself with tutors instead of courtiers. She read Cicero and Plato, translated Erasmus, and wrote in her own hand with the precision of a scholar rather than a princess. Yet beneath her discipline was unease. She had seen too many queens fall to trust stability. She was daughter to a woman condemned, sister to a king too fragile to rule. Her place in the world remained uncertain, neither commoner nor true heir, belonging everywhere and nowhere. Across the sea, Mary Stuart's world glittered brighter. The French court of King Henry II was the most splendid in Europe, a labyrinth of power, intrigue, and devotion to spectacle. The young Queen of Scots was now 13, tall, graceful, her hair copper bright under candlelight. She spoke French like a native and carried herself as one born to charm. Poets compared her to Venus. Courtiers bent their knees as if before a saint. But France, for all its beauty, was a cage gilded by diplomacy. Every smile she offered was measured, every gesture rehearsed. She belonged not to herself but to an alliance. Her betrothal to the Dauphin Francis was more than a union, it was a strategy. France hoped to bind Scotland so closely that it might claim her crown outright should she bear no heir. Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, saw the danger but understood the necessity. Scotland was too divided to stand alone. France was both protector and master. So the young queen learned early that love and power were rarely allies. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's England turned colder. Edward's health declined as the fires of reform burned higher. The zeal of the new faith threatened to consume the realm, and every noble family calculated its survival in terms of creed. Elizabeth, with her father's suspicion and her mother's wit, walked carefully between extremes. Outwardly, she conformed to the Protestant order. Inwardly, she measured its endurance. She had learned from childhood that only fools fight the storm they wait until it passes. Her composure made her both respected and feared. Courtiers remarked on her intelligence. Preachers warned of her pride. Yet even at 15, she possessed a presence that silenced rooms. The girl once erased from the line of succession began to gather gravity like a planet drawing its orbit. The winds of history were shifting again, though she could not yet see where they would carry her. In France, Mary's education was nearly complete. She hunted, danced, and debated theology with priests twice her age. Her tutors wrote admiringly of her balance of piety and wit, her laughter soft as it was strategic. But behind the pageantry, politics stirred. Her uncles, the powerful Duke of Guise and Cardinal Lorraine, saw in her marriage to the Dauphin the means to extend their family's influence to the throne itself. To them, Mary was less a niece than a dynasty in waiting. At 14, she married Francis, uniting the crowns of France and Scotland. The wedding was dazzling silks, music, incense, the scent of roses heavy in the air. The couple knelt before the altar while choirs sang of divine favor. Yet the marriage was less union than omen. For while the priest spoke of blessing, English ambassadors whispered of encirclement. Across the Channel, Elizabeth's countrymen watched with unease as the lilies of France intertwined with the thistle of Scotland. A childless England, they feared, might one day be ruled by a French queen. Elizabeth, now 20, understood the danger even more clearly. She knew that to foreign powers she was an opportunity, an unmarried tutor, potential link to legitimacy, or instrument of division. She received letters from princes, suitors, and politicians, all gilded in flattery, all concealing hunger. Yet she refused them all. To marry would be to surrender. To love would be to risk the crown she did not yet hold. Her survival depended not on affection but on restraint. When Edward VI died in 1553, the kingdom fell into chaos once more. The boy king's attempt to exclude his Catholic sister Mary from succession plunged England into crisis. Within weeks, factions clashed, loyalties fractured, and the crown passed to Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, half-sister to Elizabeth, and champion of the old faith. For Elizabeth, it was a dangerous inheritance. She was now heir to a throne claimed by a woman who regarded her as heresy made flesh. The years that followed would test both courage and conscience. Mary Tudor's reign would become synonymous with fire, the pyres of Smithfield, the ashes of martyrs, the smoke that stained the air above London like a second sky. But that story belonged to the next chapter. For now, in the dim light of 1547, two queens had come of age in separate worlds, bound by blood and destined for collision. One in France, adored yet watched. The other in England, forgotten yet waiting. Neither knew the other beyond rumor. Neither could imagine that their names would one day define an era. Yet even then, fate was drawing their paths together, two parallel lines that would one day meet in tragedy. Elizabeth's silence and Mary's radiance, two forms of the same strength, would soon confront the truth that crowns are never gifts but verdicts. As winter faded from the land and the bells of Westminster marked the passing of another year, Elizabeth stood in the courtyard of Hatfield, the cold wind biting her cheeks. She was 23, alone and uncertain. But behind her calm eyes lay something England had not yet seen, a mind sharper than steel, patient as time. Across the Channel, in the golden halls of the Louvre, Mary Stuart laughed softly beside her young husband. unaware that her happiness was already a countdown. 2 crowns, 2 destinies, 1 storm approaching. The age of daughters was about to become the age of queens. The year 1548 opened beneath a gray and restless sky. England was ruled by a child and governed by ambition. The boy King Edward VI sat upon his late father's throne, surrounded by men who spoke of faith while thinking only of power. The Reformation, once a fire controlled by royal will, now burned wild and unrestrained. Across the sea, the child Queen of Scotland had vanished from her turbulent homeland, carried away to France on winds of promise. 2 worlds, 2 destinies, moved apart, one toward survival, the other toward splendor. Elizabeth watched from the edges of history. At 15, she had become too clever for comfort. Her education outshone that of her tutors. Her composure unsettled the men who thought themselves her protectors. In the fragile peace of Edward's reign, she lived quietly at Hatfield, content to study and observe. But in England, peace was never more than a pause between storms. Her guardians changed with the tides of politics. Her safety depended on the favor of men who measured loyalty in advantage. Among them was Thomas Seymour, brother to the king's late uncle, and newly married to Catherine Parr, the widowed queen who had once been Elizabeth's refuge. Seymour was handsome, reckless, and hungry for power. His charm was the kind that corrodes. Elizabeth, still a girl, found herself drawn into his orbit, her life again shadowed by scandal not of her making. Whispers spread, sharpened by envy, and in a court where rumor was weapon, innocence offered no defense. Catherine's sudden death in childbirth deepened suspicion. The Regency Council, fearful of Seymour's ambition, arrested him for treason. Elizabeth was questioned, her composure tested by men who hoped to see her fall. But she spoke carefully, neither confessing nor accusing. Her silence saved her. Seymour's head fell on Tower Hill. Elizabeth's reputation, though bruised, remained intact. From that ordeal she learned her most enduring lesson. Affection is peril, and trust a luxury no sovereign can afford. In the years that followed, she retreated further into discipline, transforming fear into restraint. She wrote to her tutors of virtue and self-command, of the necessity to govern the passions that ruled weaker souls. She was no longer the frightened orphan of her childhood. She was becoming something sharper, an intellect honed by isolation. In France, Mary Stuart's life unfolded like a dream spun from gold. At 15, she was already queen, twice over by birth of Scotland, by marriage of France. The court of King Henry II adored her as its brightest jewel. Her husband Francis, delicate and devout, adored her with a devotion that bordered on worship. Yet beneath the pageantry, politics whispered. The Guise family, her uncles, had woven a net of influence around her marriage, seeking to rule through her beauty. To them, Mary was the key to a greater design, a united Catholic realm stretching from the Pyrenees to the Highlands. The child bride had become a living alliance. The French queen, Catherine de' Medici, saw the danger. She watched her son's young wife with suspicion, recognizing in her charm the same ambition that had once flowed through Florence. Mary's every triumph was a reminder that she, the Queen Mother, wielded less power than a foreign girl crowned by accident of birth. The tension between them shimmered behind every polite smile. Yet, for a few short years, Mary's life seemed untouched by threat. She rode through the gardens of the Louvre beneath banners stitched with lilies and thistles, a symbol of peace between 2 ancient enemies. The poets of Paris called her the morning star of the north. It was praise, but also prophecy, for stars are brightest before they fade. While Mary's world shone, Elizabeth's darkened. The young king's health began to fail, his breath shortened by disease that no physician could name. England held its breath as factions gathered like vultures. Edward's regents sought to secure the Protestant succession by excluding his Catholic sister, Mary Tudor, from the line of inheritance. But law and blood were not so easily dismissed. When Edward died in 1553, the fragile peace collapsed. The throne passed briefly to Lady Jane Grey, a crown placed upon an unwilling head, and then to the rightful heir, Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon and niece of Spain's emperor. For Elizabeth, it was a moment of triumph laced with dread. The new queen saw in her half-sister not family but threat. Elizabeth was young, Protestant, and popular, everything Mary was not. And Mary, shaped by exile and persecution, ruled by fear disguised as faith. Her reign began with ceremony and ended with smoke. Those who defied the old religion were dragged to the stake. The streets of London filled with the smell of burning flesh. The people called her Bloody Mary. Though she thought herself God's instrument, Elizabeth, under suspicion, was summoned to court. The Queen's advisors whispered that she was the focus of conspiracy, the figurehead of rebellion. Protestants across England looked to her as their silent hope. For Mary, that hope was treason. The summons came in the cold of March. Elizabeth was to present herself before the Queen. She obeyed, knowing that refusal meant death. Her ride to London was watched by silent crowds, their faces pale in the mist. They did not cheer, but they bowed. She was already legend. At Whitehall she stood before her sister's ministers, her bearing calm, her eyes unreadable. They questioned her loyalty. She offered submission. They demanded confession. She gave patience. She swore no part in rebellion. And though they found no proof, fear outweighed evidence. Soon after, she was led through the Traitor's Gate into the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother had died. The ravens watched from the battlements as she passed, and the river lapped at the stones like a memory returned. For weeks she remained within those walls, uncertain whether the next knock on her door would summon her to freedom or to the block. Yet she endured as she always had, by waiting, by observing, by thinking. Faith and fear circled her like twin predators, but she bent to neither. The girl who had once survived scandal now faced death with the same stillness. Her only companion was silence, and silence became her shield. In France, Mary knew nothing of her cousin's captivity. Her world was filled with music and devotion. Her husband newly crowned, Francis II, beside her. She was 17, radiant and beloved. The coronation united two nations under one faith, and across Europe Catholics celebrated the rise of a queen whose lineage traced back to England's own Henry VII. To them, she was not only Queen of France and Scotland, but rightful heir to the English throne, a claim that would one day ignite war. But that moment lay still ahead. For now, Elizabeth sat beneath the gray light of the tower, counting each dawn as borrowed time, while in Paris, Mary's crown glittered beneath cathedral arches. Two queens, one imprisoned by blood, the other enthroned by it, each moving further toward the destiny neither could yet see. The Tower of London was not merely a prison. It was a memory carved into stone. Its cold walls remembered every scream, every prayer, every echo of ambition turned to dust. Elizabeth felt that weight each day as she walked its narrow chambers, her footsteps following those of her mother. Outside, the world whispered of her guilt and waited for her death. Inside, she waited for history to decide whether she was heir or heretic. Weeks turned into months. Queen Mary's council debated their loyalty to their sovereign at war with the absence of evidence. The young woman in the tower had friends in every parish, sympathy in every market, and her name spoken in secret prayers. To execute her would risk rebellion. To free her would invite danger. At last, perhaps by hesitation or perhaps by fate, Mary relented. Elizabeth was released, not pardoned, not trusted, but spared. She returned to Hatfield under guard, her freedom measured in shadows. Yet she emerged from the tower changed. Her fear had cooled into purpose. She had glimpsed the machinery of power from beneath its wheels, and she would never allow it to crush her again. From her confinement she carried a new understanding. Mercy is never free, and loyalty is never safe. In the quiet halls of Hatfield, she studied the letters of Machiavelli and the histories of Livy, not for philosophy but for survival. The lessons of Rome spoke to the dangers of her own world, of ambition masked as virtue, of rulers undone by love, of the fragile thread between faith and tyranny. She learned that to rule was not to trust divine favor but to command perception. The crown, she realized, was not gold. It was performance. Mary Tudor's reign grew heavier with each year. Her marriage to Philip of Spain, arranged for faith and alliance, brought her neither heir nor peace. The people, weary of foreign influence, muttered that England had been sold to Rome. The fires that burned heretics in Smithfield lit not salvation but rebellion. The very faith she sought to restore now consumed her throne. And in every sermon, in every secret, Elizabeth's name lingered like prophecy. In the spring of 1554, rebellion erupted. Sir Thomas Wyatt led his men toward London, declaring their cause to be the defense of England from Spanish rule. Though Elizabeth took no part, her name appeared in the conspirators' papers. Once more she was accused, once more interrogated. This time she was prepared. Her replies were measured, her expression calm. She neither denied nor confessed, knowing that both could be twisted into guilt. The rebellion failed, and Wyatt died on the scaffold without betraying her. Elizabeth returned to Hatfield again alive, untouched, but not unscarred. The years between 1555 and 1558 passed like a long winter. The Queen's health declined. As her faith hardened, her husband, Philip, left for Spain. Her body, exhausted by miscarriages, betrayed her hope of an heir. The country she had tried to purify now turned against her in silence. In the markets, coins bearing her image passed from hand to hand, their silver worn thin. The people saw in them not sanctity but sorrow. Even those who prayed for her soul did so with pity. In France, the opposite fate unfolded. Mary Stuart, at the height of her glory, reigned beside her young husband Francis II. The pair, scarcely 18, embodied the triumph of Catholic unity. In portraits, they appeared as reflections of one another. Her beauty soft and luminous, his face pale and delicate. Together they were the hope of Christendom reborn. Across Europe, altars were raised in their honor. Poets likened them to angels clothed in silk. But beneath the hymns in gold, ambition moved like an undertow. Her uncles of the Guise family tightened their hold upon the French court, using the young queen's name as a weapon against their rivals. Mary, though adored, was no longer free. She had become the vessel of other men's power. When Henry II of France died suddenly in 1559, the court was plunged into mourning. Francis and Mary, scarcely crowned, ascended the throne of a realm already trembling with faction. France was rich but restless, its nobles divided by faith, its coffers drained by war. The Guise brothers ruled in all but name, their niece the jewel of their cause. Yet fate is cruel to those who shine too brightly. Francis, weak from illness, fell gravely sick within a year of his coronation. In December 1560, he died in her arms, leaving Mary a widow at 18. Her crown, once radiant, had turned to lead. The French court, quick to worship, was quicker to forget. Catherine de' Medici, now regent for her younger son, wasted no time reclaiming power. The widowed Queen of Scots was suddenly a guest without a home. Her title was foreign, her claim inconvenient. France had used her, cherished her, and was now ready to let her go. Mary, heartbroken but proud, resolved to return to the land she had left as a child. She wrote to her mother's allies in Scotland, requesting safe passage. "I return," she said, "to my own realm." Yet even she must have known that the home awaiting her was not the one she remembered. In the summer of 1561, her ships set sail from Calais. The sea that had once carried her toward promise now carried her toward peril. Behind her, France faded into mist. Ahead lay the rugged coast of Scotland, a land colder, harsher, and far less forgiving than the one of her childhood. As the cliffs of Leith came into view, she whispered a prayer not for triumph but for peace. The gulls wheeled above her like omens. The crown awaited her, but so did rebellion. That same year, in England, Mary Tudor's reign ended as it had begun in fire and faith. The queen, who had burned for belief, now burned with fever, her strength consumed by years of loss. Philip remained in Spain. Her hopes for an heir died with her. On the morning of the 17th of November, 1558, she closed her eyes and released her crown to the sister she had once feared most. Elizabeth, at Hatfield, received the news with measured grace. Those present said she fell to her knees and spoke softly, "It is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Whether she said it or not, the moment marked a turning point for history. The child, once branded bastard, now wore the crown of England. The kingdom she inherited was wounded, divided, and uncertain, but it was hers. Across the sea, another queen prepared to rule, her heart heavy with loss, but her ambition unbroken. 2 women, 2 thrones, 2 nations born of the same blood and divided by belief. The world that had watched their fathers wage war, now prepared to watch their daughters decide the fate of an age. The child bride had become a widow, the prisoner had become a queen, and though they did not yet know it, their destinies were already turning toward each other, drawn by a gravity older than choice. In the silence between them, history held its breath. The dawn that rose over England in November 1558 carried no sound of triumph, only the soft sigh of relief. The bells that had once tolled for executions now rang for coronation. After years of smoke and fear, the air itself seemed to breathe again. Elizabeth Tudor, 25 years old, walked through the cold corridors of Hatfield as messengers knelt before her. The crown had come at last, not by conquest or gift, but by endurance. Her sister Mary was dead, her father's sins forgotten, her mother's disgrace redeemed by time. The child born of rebellion had become the hope of renewal. Her coronation was both pageant and penance. London dressed itself in gold and green. Banners fluttered from windows, streets filled with cheers that were as much for survival as for sovereignty. The people who had endured fire and famine now saw in her a mirror of deliverance. She moved among them with the stillness of one who understood both the weight and the fragility of devotion. The air smelled of wax and rain. When the crown was placed upon her head in Westminster Abbey, it seemed less a gift of heaven than a challenge from it. Around her, bishops murmured prayers in English, a tongue that had once been forbidden, but now carried divine authority. In that single act, the Church of England was reborn. Elizabeth's first words as queen were measured, the product of long silence. She spoke of peace, of unity, of the realm's weary need for balance. Yet she knew that words were only bridges. The rivers they crossed were deep. Her counsel was divided between old faith and new, between those who served her father and those who had betrayed her mother. She chose her ministers, not for their loyalty, but for their usefulness. William Cecil, shrewd and tireless, became her secretary and the quiet architect of her reign. Through him, she learned that power was less a sword than a compass it did not strike. It guided. But even as England crowned its queen, the storm beyond the Channel was already gathering. In France, Mary Stuart, newly widowed, wept in silks blacker than her sorrow. The death of Francis had left her without husband, child, or purpose. The courtiers who had once bowed to her now looked past her to the regent, Catherine de' Medici. Her uncles of the House of Guise, still powerful, urged her to remain, to claim her place in the hierarchy of France. Yet she was no longer a child. The same pride that had once made her luminous now made her restless. "I am queen of a greater realm," she told those who pitied her. "I will return to my own." Scotland awaited her like a promise, half kept and half feared. Since her departure 13 years before, the land had been torn apart by faith and faction. The Reformation had found voice there under men like John Knox, whose sermons thundered against the corruption of Rome and the vanity of queens. Monasteries lay in ruin. Churches echoed with new hymns. The nobles, who had once ruled in her name, now ruled for themselves. To them, the Queen's return was both hope and hazard. To Elizabeth, it was a problem. Two young women of royal blood, both unmarried, both crowned by destiny, now stood on the same stage. Europe would not let them coexist for long. Elizabeth understood at once the symbolism of Mary's claim. As granddaughter of Henry VII's daughter, she carried a legitimate right to the English throne in Catholic eyes. Her marriage to the late French king had made her briefly Queen of France and Scotland, and, by the reckoning of Rome, rightful Queen of England as well. For Elizabeth, who had fought so hard to secure her father's legacy, this was more than insult. It was an existential threat. A single papal decree could turn her reign into heresy. Yet she did not rage. She did what she always did, she waited. Her first year on the throne was spent weaving stability out of fracture. She restored the Protestant settlement, making the English Bible and Book of Common Prayer the anchors of her church. But her genius lay in ambiguity. The language of her decrees was gentle, the punishments mild, the tone cautious. She demanded conformity, not zeal. In her presence, Catholics could remain loyal. Protestants could believe themselves triumphant. To the world, it looked like tolerance. To her, it was control. Her motto, chosen for its elegance and cunning, was Semper Idem, always the same. It meant not immobility, but balance. She would be constant because constancy was power. At court, her image became a second crown. Artists painted her as the embodiment of virtue, roses for purity, pearls for wisdom, suns and moons woven into her gowns as symbols of divine order. She allowed the legend to grow, knowing that myth ruled hearts more effectively than armies. But in private, she was pragmatic. Her letters reveal no illusion of sanctity, only the steady calculation of survival. "I do not desire to make windows into men's souls," she once said. She meant it. In an age when faith divided families and kingdoms, she ruled by keeping her own a mystery. Across the Channel, Mary's ships cut through the August mist of 1561. The voyage from Calais to Leith was brief but perilous, the sea as gray as steel. She stood on deck, wrapped in a dark cloak, her attendants pale and silent around her. Behind her lay France's splendor, before her the hard outline of her native land. When she stepped ashore, the rain fell as if the sky itself were uncertain how to greet her. The bells of Edinburgh rang not in joy, but in curiosity. Their queen had returned, but their faith had changed. The court she entered was a far cry from the elegance of the Louvre. The nobles wore rough wool instead of velvet. The castle halls smelled of smoke and rain. Yet Mary adapted quickly. She spoke with charm, promised moderation, and filled her court with music and light. Her beauty disarmed, her presence dazzled. For a moment, even her enemies paused. But behind every compliment was caution, and behind every oath was fear. The ministers who served her were men of the new faith, their allegiance conditional, their ambition restless. Mary, with her Catholic heart and royal certainty, believed she could unite them. History would prove otherwise. In England, Elizabeth received news of her cousin's arrival with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She sent letters of welcome, warm in tone, cold in intent. "We trust your reign shall bring peace to your realm," she wrote. And beneath those words lay the true message: remain in your realm. To Elizabeth, Mary's presence in Scotland was acceptable only so long as it stayed north of the border. Two suns cannot share the same sky. That winter, the two queens began their silent dance, one of correspondence, courtesies, and calculation. They exchanged gifts, flattery, and suspicion. Elizabeth's counsel urged her to keep watch. Cecil warned that the real danger was not invasion but influence. A queen who believed herself divinely chosen could not coexist with one declared illegitimate. Mary, for her part, saw Elizabeth as both kin and obstacle, the elder sister whose throne should one day be hers. Between them stretched not just a border, but the very fault line of Europe, faith against faith, past against future. As the year turned, England grew prosperous again. Trade revived, coin stabilized, and the scent of stability returned to London's markets. Yet beneath the order, a tremor remained. Every victory of peace deepened the unease of destiny, for Elizabeth knew, as Mary did, that history does not rest, it circles. The two crowns, once separated by sea, were now bound by fate. The game had begun. The kingdom Elizabeth inherited was fragile, its peace no thicker than parchment. Beyond London's walls, the fields still bore scars of neglect. The churches stood stripped and hollow from decades of reform. Yet she saw not ruin but possibility. To her, disorder was not a burden, it was freedom. From the fragments of her father's empire, she could build something new, something lasting, if only she could keep the faiths from devouring one another. Her first challenge came not from abroad but from within her own conscience. The bishops who had served her sister refused to recognize her supremacy over the church. Their loyalty to Rome was unbroken, their defiance cloaked in piety. Elizabeth met them with the same cold patience she had once shown her interrogators in the Tower. She removed them quietly, replacing them with men of learning rather than zeal. Where Mary Tudor had ruled through fire, Elizabeth ruled through fatigue. She understood that terror breeds martyrs, but weariness breeds obedience. England, exhausted by extremity, yielded to moderation. Parliament, sensing both her intelligence and her resolve, confirmed the new settlement. The Act of Supremacy declared her the supreme governor of the Church of England, a title softened by diplomacy, yet absolute in effect. The Act of Uniformity restored the Book of Common Prayer, binding her people once more to worship in their own tongue. In one stroke, she had transformed her father's rebellion and her sister's persecution into a faith both national and personal. She had turned religion from a war into a language, and herself into its grammar. But while England healed, Scotland trembled. The arrival of Mary Stuart in 1561 had stirred every buried faction into motion. Her charm, so effective in France, met suspicion in the grey streets of Edinburgh. Her Catholic Mass, celebrated privately at Holyrood, enraged the Protestant lords, who called it an abomination in the heart of reformed soil. John Knox thundered from his pulpit that no woman may rule over men. His sermons aimed as much at Mary as at the Queen across the border. Yet she did not banish him. She thought persuasion stronger than punishment. It was a mistake Elizabeth would never have made. Mary's beauty became both her weapon and her weakness. Poets sang her virtues, nobles swore her loyalty, but beneath the flattery lay division. Half her court knelt toward Rome, the other half read the English Bible in secret. She tried to bridge the gulf with grace, inviting Protestant leaders to her table, attending their sermons and smiling at their fury. But compromise, in Scotland, was a foreign language. Her half-measures pleased no one. The nobles tolerated her for her lineage, not her policy. And beyond her borders, Elizabeth watched every step with measured fascination. In London, reports from Cecil's agents painted a portrait both alluring and alarming. They described Mary's court as a place of splendor rising from ruin, her music and laughter masking the slow pulse of rebellion. Elizabeth read the dispatches in silence, her expression unreadable. She understood that Mary's charm was the most dangerous kind, soft, unassuming, disarming. Power that does not announce itself can move unseen. "Keep her in Scotland," Cecil urged. "There she can do little harm." Elizabeth agreed. It was not yet time for confrontation. Time was the ally of those who could endure it. The two queens, though they had never met, began to correspond. Their letters were masterpieces of diplomacy, flattering, cautious, filled with warmth that concealed unease. Elizabeth addressed Mary as "our dear sister and cousin," and Mary replied in kind. But each word was measured against a mirror of suspicion. Elizabeth's questions about her cousin's faith were veiled inquiries into loyalty. Mary's promises of friendship carried the echo of entitlement. To Elizabeth, Mary's existence was a question mark written in blood. To Mary, Elizabeth's crown was a throne borrowed from her birthright. Beyond the courts and the letters, Europe watched. Spain, ruled by the stern and silent Philip II, regarded both queens as pieces on a divine chessboard. To him, Elizabeth was the heretic daughter of a usurper. Mary, the rightful heir who might restore England to Rome. France, still mourning its young king, saw in Mary's return an opportunity to retain influence in the north, and in Rome, the Pope withheld recognition of Elizabeth's rule, waiting to see which faith would outlast the other. The continent that had once divided over their fathers now divided over them. Elizabeth's court grew into a theater of symbolism. Masks and pageants celebrated her as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, ordained by God and untouched by mortal weakness. The title was not merely flattery, it was strategy. Marriage, for her, was not alliance but vulnerability. Every suitor, Spanish, Austrian, or English, was both potential husband and potential usurper. She flirted with the idea of marriage as she did with politics, promising everything, yielding nothing. Her refusal baffled men, but it made her invincible. The virgin crown became the emblem of her reign, purity as power, solitude as sovereignty. Mary, by contrast, could not rule alone. Her council pressed her to remarry, to secure an heir and stabilize her kingdom. Suitors arrived from across Europe, princes, nobles, and ambassadors carrying portraits and promises. But her heart, still wounded by loss, resisted calculation. Her uncle urged prudence, her faith urged patience, her youth urged passion. And in that conflict lay her future. The winter of 1561 settled over both realms like a curtain of frost. In London, Elizabeth studied the reports from Scotland late into the night, her candle burning long after the courtiers had retired. She knew the quiet between them could not last. Sooner or later, crowns of equal claim cannot coexist. The winds of Europe were shifting, and she intended to be the one to shape their direction. Across the border, in Edinburgh, Mary stood before her window, watching snow fall over the city she had returned to rule. In her reflection, she saw not triumph, but expectation, the look of a woman who must become either legend or lesson. Neither queen could yet see the path ahead. The betrayals, the blood, the prison walls, the gallows, the centuries of debate their names would inspire. They only felt the pull of destiny, slow and inevitable as the turning of the earth. One ruled by calculation, the other by conviction. One trusted no one, the other too many. Between them lay a kingdom divided not by swords but by souls. The year closed with the sound of bells. Across two capitals, London and Edinburgh, two cities bound by faith, fear, and the invisible thread of kinship. Elizabeth's England rejoiced in a peace that felt eternal. Mary's Scotland trembled in a calm that felt temporary. Both women stood at the threshold of greatness, unaware that each step forward brought them closer to each other and to ruin. The virgin crown gleamed brightly that winter, but every light casts a shadow. The autumn rain fell over Edinburgh like a curtain of iron. It hissed against the stones of Holyrood Palace, seeped through the tapestries, and whispered in the corridors where Mary, Queen of Scots, walked alone. The court she had left as a child had become a land of strangers. The nobles bowed, but without warmth. The priests prayed, but without confidence. She had returned to her kingdom, as if to a house long abandoned, her name written above the door, yet every room rearranged. Scotland in 1561 was a land trembling between past and future. The old faith clung to its relics in ruined monasteries, while the new preachers thundered from wooden pulpits. John Knox's voice rose above them all, a storm of conviction echoing through the narrow closes of Edinburgh. He spoke of God's wrath upon idolatry, of judgment upon Jezebels who ruled men. The people listened, half in awe, half in fear. and the Queen, newly returned from the splendor of France, became the living symbol of the war between faiths. Mary's first act upon arrival had been to hear Mass in her private chapel. It was a gesture of devotion, not defiance, but in Scotland, the difference no longer mattered. Crowds gathered outside Holyrood, shouting against the idle Queen. Yet Mary refused to yield. "I will compel none," she said, though her words carried little weight with men who thought obedience owed to God alone. She faced them not with armies but with charm, the same grace that had melted the frost of the French court. She met her enemies with smiles, her allies with promises, her counsel with patience. And for a time, it worked. Her beauty softened suspicion. Her voice carried the cadence of peace. But peace is a fragile thing in a land where belief has teeth. Elizabeth, in London, followed every movement of her cousin with fascination, sharpened by fear. Reports from her agents in Scotland arrived weekly. The sermons of Knox, the factions among the nobles, the Queen's private councils. To her secretary, William Cecil, she said little, but her eyes betrayed calculation. Mary's presence on the throne of Scotland was more than political, it was symbolic. She was the Catholic alternative to Elizabeth's Protestant legitimacy, the living challenge to the English succession. The Pope might one day bless her claim, and with that blessing, half of Europe would march beneath her banner. It was not war Elizabeth feared, but invitation, the kind that comes wrapped in piety and crowned with lilies. And yet, Elizabeth could not bring herself to hate her cousin. There was a strange admiration between them, though they had never met. Mary was everything Elizabeth chose, not to be open, impulsive, romantic. Elizabeth saw in her a reflection of the dangers she herself had avoided. To Mary, life was passion. To Elizabeth, it was patience. They were two mirrors facing each other, endless reflections of desire and restraint. In Scotland, Mary's first years passed in uneasy balance. She restored order to her court, calmed feuds among the nobles, and surrounded herself with trusted advisors. She held audiences, rode among her people, listened to petitions, and played the lute in the evenings, her laughter echoing through the halls that had once known only argument. To many, she seemed the embodiment of reconciliation, a Catholic who tolerated Protestant worship, a monarch who ruled by persuasion rather than decree. Even Knox, who despised her religion, found himself forced to acknowledge her intellect. "This queen," he admitted grudgingly, "hath a spirit far above her sex." But he also warned that such a spirit was the devil's disguise. The challenge Mary faced was not only religious, but personal. Her half-brother, James Stuart, the Earl of Moray, was her most loyal servant in appearance, and her greatest rival in truth. A Protestant favored by Elizabeth's court, he stood as the bridge and barrier between the two queens. Mary trusted him, perhaps because she wished to. She saw in him stability. He saw in her opportunity. Around them gathered a council divided in creed and conscience, their allegiance as shifting as the Scottish weather. Elizabeth's envoys watched with interest. Some urged her to marry, to secure her throne through an heir, and end the question of succession once and for all. But she refused, as she always had. Marriage meant alliance, and alliance meant compromise. To be wife or mother was to belong to someone else. To remain single was to belong only to England. And so, as Mary sought a husband to stabilize her realm, Elizabeth transformed her solitude into strategy. She became the virgin queen, not out of purity but out of power. Her body became the boundary between politics and possession. It was a weapon, and she wielded it perfectly. Mary, however, was still young enough to believe in love. Suitors from across Europe pressed their claims, princes of Spain, archdukes of Austria, and English nobles eager for royal favor. Elizabeth, wary of any union that might strengthen Mary's position, interfered with subtle skill. She proposed her own favorite, Robert Dudley, a match so improbable that it seemed insult disguised as diplomacy. Mary saw through it instantly. The Queen would give me her servant, she is said to have remarked privately, to keep me her servant still. Whether true or not, the sentiment captured the gulf between them. By 1563, Mary's patience began to thin. Her parliament urged her to marry. Her advisers whispered that without an heir, her crown would crumble. Yet each proposal carried political cost. To marry a foreign prince risked her people's loyalty. To marry a Protestant lord risked her faith. The court buzzed with speculation. Elizabeth's ambassadors reported every rumor, every flirtation, every private word. The Queen of Scots, Cecil wrote, standeth upon a precipice of her own making. In that same year, plague swept through London, carrying away the poor by hundreds each week. Elizabeth fled to Windsor, her court reduced to silence by fear of infection. She ruled by letter and proclamation, her handwriting firm even as the kingdom trembled. Her reign, though still young, had already survived famine, rebellion, and plague. She had become the axis upon which England turned. Her people no longer saw her as merely a monarch. They saw her as the realm itself. Across the border, Mary stood at a window in Holyrood, watching snow fall upon the city. She had governed for nearly 3 years and won admiration but not allegiance. Her tolerance had kept her throne, but tolerance cannot inspire devotion. Her nobles obeyed her but did not love her. Her people loved her but did not trust her. She felt the weight of her isolation press more heavily with each passing winter. Power, she was learning, is colder than exile. The year 1564 would bring warmth again, and with it, danger disguised as affection. Somewhere in that year's unfolding, amid feasts, hunts, and dances, Mary Stuart would meet the man who would change her fate forever, Henry Darnley. But for now, the snow fell, and the two queens stood on opposite sides of the same silence, each convinced she could master the other, and neither seeing the abyss already opening beneath them. The return of the Queen of Scots had begun as a homecoming. It was becoming a reckoning. The year 1564 unfolded gently across the British Isles, its early months marked by an uncommon stillness. The storms that had battered England and Scotland alike seemed to withdraw, leaving both kingdoms in an uneasy peace. Elizabeth's rule had grown firm, her government efficient, her image unassailable. In portraits she appeared radiant, clothed in gold and pearls, her hair a halo of red light, a monarch born from legend. Yet behind her serenity lay calculation. She had learned that fear, when wrapped in grace, ruled better than cruelty. Every act of mercy strengthened her grip. Every delay in decision deepened her authority. Mary's world, by contrast, remained suspended between dream and danger. The Scottish nobles bowed, but their loyalty bent like reeds in wind. Her half-brother, the Earl of Moray, served as her counselor and her conscience. But his allegiance was to stability more than blood. The Kirk, led by Knox, watched her with suspicion that not even kindness could erase. Each morning she heard the bells of street giles ring for the Protestant service and knew they tolled against her faith, yet she endured them. She told herself that patience was her strength, that, in time, even the hardest hearts could be softened by grace. But time, for a queen, is never patient. With each year that passed, the question of her marriage became heavier. An unmarried monarch invited speculation, conspiracy, and pity. Her council urged her to wed for the good of the realm, and foreign ambassadors arrived with portraits and proposals. She studied them all: the Spanish princes, the Austrian archdukes, the French dukes of noble blood. Their faces blurred together in her mind, solemn, distant, burdened by politics. None stirred her heart, and fewer suited her purpose. It was then that Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, appeared at her court. He was tall, golden-haired, and charming, a youth with the confidence of lineage and the vanity of beauty. His claim to royal blood matched her own. He was the son of the Earl of Lennox, himself descended from the Tudor line. To marry Darnley would unite two branches of the same royal house and strengthen her claim to the English throne. What began as curiosity soon became fascination. He moved through her court with the ease of one born to admiration. To her attendants, he was gallant. To her musicians, he was kind. To her heart, he was destiny disguised as love. Elizabeth received the news of his arrival with an unease she did not disguise. She knew Darnley's ambition, knew his father's restlessness, and saw in this match the shape of a threat. If Mary, Queen of Scots, were to marry an English noble of royal descent, her claim to England's crown would become irresistible to Catholic Europe. "It is a match," Cecil warned, "that touches both crowns at once." Elizabeth sent letters of polite concern, framed in the language of sisterly affection. She reminded Mary that royal marriages required the counsel of equals, that haste was the enemy of prudence. But her words arrived too late, or perhaps precisely in time to ignite defiance. For Mary, Elizabeth's warning was an insult. To her, it was not counsel but condescension. She saw in her cousin's hesitation the shadow of rivalry, and in her restraint, jealousy. She told her council that she would marry whom she pleased, and she meant it. The more England protested, the more certain she became. In Darnley's presence, she found not only affection but alliance, a partner who could share her claim, her faith, and her defiance. Her advisers cautioned patience. She dismissed them. When Darnley fell ill that spring, she visited him daily, tending him herself. By the time he recovered, the decision was already made. In July 1565, Mary announced her intention to marry Henry Darnley. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Her half-brother Moray withdrew from court, warning that the union would divide the realm. The Protestant lords, fearing a Catholic revival, began to conspire. Elizabeth, learning of the engagement, withdrew her ambassador in protest. Across Europe, the news rippled through courts and cathedrals. Some called it romance, others recklessness, but all agreed it was irrevocable. The wedding took place in the chapel of Holyrood Palace on a summer morning heavy with incense. Mary wore black velvet, still in mourning for Francis, her first husband. Darnley stood beside her, proud and radiant. When the Latin Mass began, a murmur rose among the Protestant courtiers. It was the first time in years that such rites had been sung in the heart of Scotland. To her enemies, it was proof that their queen meant to drag the country back to Rome. To her, it was simply faith restored. The vows were spoken, the bells rang, and the Queen of Scots was once more a wife. But the ceremony that bound their hands would also bind her to ruin. Darnley, within weeks, revealed the flaws that love had concealed. He was vain, arrogant, and reckless, intoxicated by his new title, though it was a title without power. Mary refused to share her crown with him. He was king in name only, and the slight cut deep. He began to demand authority, to resent her counsel, to conspire in secret. The charm that had once captivated her now curdled into pride. Even her attendants, once fond of him, began to whisper. The man who had seemed her salvation became her shadow. Elizabeth, hearing of his conduct, allowed herself a rare smile. She sent word to her court that she pitied her cousin but admired her courage. In private she said nothing, for she needed say nothing. Time, she knew, would do her work for her. The match that had threatened England now threatened Scotland instead. Power, when misjudged, consumes its bearer. By the close of 1565, the kingdom trembled again. Moray and the Protestant lords raised their banners in rebellion, claiming to defend the realm from papist tyranny. The Queen rode out in person to face them, her courage unshaken. Clad in armor, she led her forces through rain and mud, her hair bound beneath a steel helmet. For a brief moment, Scotland saw not a widow, not a bride, but a monarch. The rebels scattered before her, and she returned to Edinburgh in triumph. The victory was real, but the cost invisible. Darnley, humiliated by her success, withdrew from her side. The crown that had united them now divided them completely. As winter fell, Mary's court glittered with torchlight and rumor. Feasts were held, masks performed. Music played late into the night, but beneath the laughter ran a current of tension. Darnley's drinking worsened. His jealousy deepened. He accused her of betrayal, of neglect, of the very sins he himself committed. The courtiers learned to read her silences, to fear his outbursts, to watch without speaking. And in London, Elizabeth read her ambassadors' reports with the same cool detachment she reserved for prophecy. The two queens, once mirrors of ambition, had become reflections of contrast, one strengthened by solitude, the other undone by love. The year ended in frost, the northern winds howling across the moors. In the great halls of Holyrood, the fires burned bright, but could not warm the air between husband and wife. Somewhere in the stillness, the first seeds of tragedy took root. Mary, restless and weary, looked into the flames and saw her fate flicker there, a warning written in ash. Love, she was learning, is the most dangerous form of faith. The winter that followed Mary's marriage to Darnley seemed to last longer than any before it. Snow lay heavy on the roofs of Edinburgh, and the air inside Holyrood grew cold with silence. The court that had once hummed with music now whispered in corners. The Queen of Scots moved through her own halls, as though among strangers, her smile a formality, her warmth reserved for memory. The husband she had once adored now stood beside her as a burden she could neither carry nor cast aside. Darnley's charm, once irresistible, had soured into arrogance. He demanded recognition not only as her consort, but as her equal, pressing his claim to the crown matrimonial, a title that would grant him authority should she die without an heir. Mary refused, knowing too well the danger of yielding such power to a man so reckless. His resentment deepened. He drank heavily, consorted with flatterers, and filled the nights with suspicion. He accused her of indifference, of betrayal, of loving her realm more than her husband. His pride, wounded by her composure, turned to rage. But Mary, though weary, did not yield. She had been raised among kings and cardinals. She knew that silence could be sharper than any word. She surrounded herself with counselors she could trust, men of learning and loyalty, among them David Rizzio, an Italian musician who had risen from servant to secretary through intellect and charm. He was graceful, educated, discreet, everything Darnley was not. To Mary, he was indispensable. To Darnley, intolerable. Rizzio's presence became a mirror for Darnley's inadequacy. The court saw how the queen laughed in his company, how she trusted his counsel, how he managed her correspondence with foreign courts. Whispers spread, as whispers always do, carrying envy in their breath. Some said Rizzio ruled her heart. Others said he ruled her will. None dared speak such things to her face, but Darnley heard them all and believed every one. What began as jealousy grew into obsession. In his mind, the foreign secretary was not a servant but a usurper, and in a kingdom already trembling with division, such thoughts were not madness, they were prophecy. Elizabeth, watching from London, read the rumors with fascination. Her spies in Scotland sent coded letters describing Darnley's growing instability and Mary's isolation. To her secretary, Cecil, Elizabeth remarked that a storm gathers in that northern air. It was not concern she felt, but the cold satisfaction of distance. The cousin who had once seemed a rival was now unraveling beneath the weight of her own heart. Elizabeth knew that power needs no enemy more dangerous than passion. By early 1566, Mary's situation had become perilous. She was with child, her body weakened, her spirit tested. The court, divided between Catholic and Protestant factions, balanced uneasily on rumor. Her half-brother Moray had fled to England after rebelling against her marriage, leaving her surrounded by those whose loyalty was measured in convenience. Yet she clung to her role with determination. The birth of an heir, she believed, would restore stability. But Darnley saw it differently. In the child's birth, he foresaw his own irrelevance. A queen with an heir needed no husband. In March, the mask of civility broke. On a night of wind and candlelight, as the queen dined in her private chamber with Rizzio and a few attendants, the door burst open. Darnley stood there, pale and trembling, followed by a group of armed men, noble conspirators, who had promised him restoration of honor in exchange for blood. What happened next became legend. But even legend cannot match the horror. Rizzio was dragged from the table, struck again and again before her eyes, his cries echoing against the walls. When the silence returned, he lay dead beneath her feet. The floor was stained with 7 wounds. Mary, clinging to her belly, was spared only by the weight of the crown she carried within her. The city outside heard the commotion but did not intervene. Holyrood's torches flickered, and the night seemed to lengthen without end. When dawn came, it revealed a queen transformed. The grief that might have broken her instead hardened into clarity. Darnley, shaken by what he had done, sought her forgiveness, but her eyes had changed. She spoke little, but her silence carried the gravity of judgment. In the days that followed, she turned her enemies against one another with quiet precision. The same nobles who had aided her husband now found themselves exposed. Their alliances dissolved as quickly as they had formed. Within a week, the queen had retaken control of her palace and her destiny. Elizabeth's court received the news with morbid fascination. Some pitied the Scottish queen, others mocked her. "She has learned," one ambassador wrote, "that crowns are not made of gold, but of blood." Elizabeth herself made no public comment. Yet those close to her said she spent long hours in her chambers, reading the reports, her expression unreadable. Perhaps she saw in Mary's suffering a warning written for her own reflection, a reminder of how thin the line between majesty and ruin could be. In June 1566, amid turmoil and exhaustion, Mary gave birth to a son, James, Prince of Scotland. The nation rejoiced, for an heir promised continuity, and continuity promised peace. Bells rang across Edinburgh, and for a brief moment, hope returned to her kingdom. But even that joy carried shadow. Darnley's pride flared anew, demanding acknowledgement as the child's father and rightful king. Yet his actions had made him unworthy of both titles. The queen's heart, once open, had turned to stone where his name was written. In the months that followed, Darnley withdrew from court, fearing revenge from those he had once called allies. His paranoia grew. His health declined. He sent desperate letters to Mary, pleading for reconciliation, offering repentance. She replied with courtesy but no warmth. The distance between them, once emotional, became physical. He left Edinburgh for Glasgow, where illness, perhaps real, perhaps imagined, confined him to bed. She visited him there in January 1567, bringing their infant son and words of forgiveness. To those who watched, it seemed a gesture of mercy. To those who knew her better, it looked like farewell. The queen persuaded Darnley to return to Edinburgh, promising reconciliation. A house was prepared for him at Kirk-a-Field, just beyond the city walls. There, he was lodged under gentle guard, attended by servants, and visited by her daily. The city whispered that peace had returned between them. But peace, in Mary's world, was never more dangerous than when it seemed real. Beneath the calm surface of Holyrood, the undercurrents of conspiracy stirred again. Scotland, like its queen, was learning that love and power are two sides of the same blade. The winds of February carried a strange stillness, the kind that falls before a storm. In the narrow streets of Edinburgh, torches burned low, and the castle bells marked the hours with solemn precision. In Kirk-a-Field, Darnley slept beneath a roof that smelled faintly of smoke and new plaster. Outside, a handful of figures moved quietly in the dark. The city would soon awaken to a sound that would change its history forever. The murder had not yet occurred, but already the night had chosen its name. The night of February 9th, 1567, was bitter and windless. Edinburgh lay cloaked in silence, the stars hidden behind low clouds. In the narrow streets, taverns had gone dark, and the watchmen's torches flickered like restless ghosts. Beyond the city walls, in the quiet fields south of the kirk, a single house stood apart, modest in appearance, guarded yet strangely exposed. Inside, Henry Darnley slept. He was 21 years old, a king in name, a fugitive in all else. The chamber was simple, a bed of carved oak, a crucifix above the hearth, a few candles burning low. Outside, the guards kept their posts, unaware that they too were part of the design. In another house nearby, the Queen of Scots attended a wedding feast, her presence radiant, her demeanor calm. She spoke little, smiled when expected, and left before midnight. Witnesses would later remember her composure, the grace of a woman untroubled by fear. But history, like the night, conceals as much as it reveals. At Kirkfield, the hours crept toward dawn. The last sound Darnley heard was the faint creak of a door. Then the world shattered. The explosion tore through the dark like the voice of judgment. Windows in the city burst open, walls trembled, and the sleeping citizens awoke to the echo of thunder where there was no storm. When the smoke cleared, the house was gone, reduced to ash and timbers. In a nearby orchard, 2 bodies were found, Darnley and his servant, half-dressed, unmarked by flame. They had not died from the blast. They had been strangled. By sunrise, the city was alive with whispers. The Queen's husband was dead, and the method of his death spoke of conspiracy, not fate. Some claimed she had ordered it. Others swore she was its victim. The truth was lost amid the rush to assign blame. In the cold light of morning, Mary appeared at Holyrood, pale but composed. She ordered an inquiry, offered a reward, and received condolences with the steadiness of ritual. Yet her silence, once her strength, now betrayed her. In the absence of denial, guilt took root. Elizabeth received the news with astonishment that quickly turned to caution. "What a tragedy," she said to her council, though her tone carried neither grief nor surprise. To Cecil, she wrote that the affair soundeth ill in the ears of all men. It was the language of warning, not comfort. In truth, she felt both pity and vindication. Mary's crown, once radiant, was now stained. Her throne, once steady, began to tremble. The rival who had once threatened England's peace had destroyed her own. In Scotland, the shock gave way to outrage. Pamphlets appeared overnight, bearing accusations written in coarse ink and fierce conviction. They called the Queen a Jezebel, a murderess, a woman consumed by lust and pride. The name that once inspired reverence now drew curses in the marketplace. Her council, divided and fearful, urged her to act swiftly to prove her innocence. But Mary hesitated. She was trapped between grief, politics, and something darker, an unspoken knowledge of how deeply betrayal can burrow into the heart. For among those who had moved in the shadows of that fatal night stood a man who now offered her comfort. James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. He was bold, reckless, and loyal only to himself, a soldier of fortune with scars to prove it. He had been among her most capable nobles, her defender in times of peril, her companion in weariness. Now he became her shield against accusation. He stood beside her when others fled, rode at her side through hostile streets, and spoke for her when words failed. The people saw this and whispered again. Each defense of her honor sounded like devotion, each act of protection like possession. Spring came slowly that year, and with it, unease. The investigation into Darnley's murder dissolved into confusion. Witnesses vanished, documents disappeared, and the few who dared to speak did so in riddles. The name of Bothwell appeared in every rumor, but the Queen refused to condemn him. Whether through loyalty, blindness, or manipulation, she placed her trust in the very man the kingdom suspected. To her enemies, this was proof enough. To her allies, it was madness. In April, Bothwell was brought to trial. The charges were grave, the evidence overwhelming, yet the proceedings lasted a single day. Witnesses were absent. The verdict, inevitable. He was declared innocent, and the crowd, paid or terrified, shouted their approval. The Queen's government, weakened by division, accepted the outcome in silence. But the silence was worse than guilt. It sounded like consent. Within a week, Bothwell's men intercepted the Queen's procession near Edinburgh. He claimed it was for her protection. Others called it abduction. Mary rode with him to Dunbar Castle, where he kept her under close guard. When she emerged days later, she was changed. She announced her intention to marry the Earl of Bothwell, the man accused of murdering her husband. The scandal was immediate and universal. Even her closest supporters recoiled. The nobles who had once knelt at her coronation now turned their banners against her. Her half-brother Moray prepared to return from exile, his cause blessed by England. Elizabeth, publicly silent, privately approved. The Queen of Scots had crossed the threshold from misfortune into folly. The marriage took place in May 1567, solemn and joyless. The court, dressed in black, watched as vows were exchanged without music or blessing. The Protestant ceremony offended her Catholic conscience. The man beside her offended everything else. Yet she endured it, perhaps out of defiance, perhaps out of despair. Power, once her birthright, had become her burden, and love, that ancient refuge of queens, had turned to poison. Within weeks, rebellion rose like a tide. The nobles, calling themselves the Confederate Lords, gathered armies and demanded her abdication. Bothwell, brave in battle but reckless in command, met them at Carberry Hill. The Queen rode beside him, her banner bearing the motto, "En ma défense, Dieu me défend." In my defense, God me defend. But God or fortune did not. Her army, outnumbered and divided, faltered. Bothwell fled into exile. She surrendered. The people who once hailed her as divine now shouted curses as she was led through Edinburgh. The crowd threw mud, stones, and words sharper than both. She was taken to Loch Leven Castle, an island prison surrounded by dark water and cold wind. There, stripped of her jewels and titles, she became again what she had once been, a captive of her own destiny. Elizabeth, upon hearing of her cousin's capture, maintained her silence for 3 days. When she finally spoke, it was with the calm of a woman who had long foreseen the outcome. "This," she said, "is a lesson written in a queen's hand." Yet her letters to Scotland called for mercy, for justice, for restraint. They were words of pity spoken by a mind already measuring the political gain. For the fall of Mary was the fortification of Elizabeth. One crown dimmed so the other might shine brighter. The murder of Henry Darnley had done more than end a life. It had ended an era. The light of the young queen's reign, once warm, radiant, and full of promise, had turned cold. From this point on, her story would no longer belong to romance or politics, but to tragedy. The fire that consumed her husband had lit the path to her own destruction. And far away in London, the Virgin Queen watched, not with joy, but with the understanding of one who knew that every triumph is haunted by reflection. In the still waters of Loch Leven, Mary's crown waited beneath the surface, glinting faintly like something remembered and lost. The queen who had ruled with charm and conviction was gone. What remained was a prisoner of history, a woman whose choices had turned into prophecy. The summer of 1567 passed over Scotland like a shadow that refused to move. Loch Leven lay still beneath a grey sky, its waters deep and cold as polished stone. Upon the island at its center stood a fortress, small, ancient, and silent. There, behind iron doors and damp walls, Mary, Queen of Scots, awaited her fate. The woman who had once ruled with charm and splendor now walked among guards and servants who did not kneel. Her world had narrowed to a few rooms, a garden, and the reflection of clouds upon water. Each morning she rose at dawn, heard Mass from the hands of her priest, and stared across the lake toward the distant hills of Kinross. Freedom seemed close enough to touch, yet forever receding. She wrote letters to Elizabeth, to the nobles who had betrayed her, to the foreign courts that had once celebrated her beauty. Some were appeals for justice, others for compassion, but all carried the same refrain: she was still a queen. Her captors, reading them, smiled. A crown, once surrendered, is never returned. In Edinburgh, her abdication had been drafted and signed, a document born not of choice but of exhaustion. Under threat and despair, she had agreed to yield the throne to her infant son. The child, James VI, scarcely 1 year old, was crowned in Stirling with a golden crown too heavy for his small head. Around him stood the same men who had overthrown his mother, their faces stern with triumph disguised as duty. The Earl of Moray, her half-brother, returned from exile to act as regent. The Queen's name was erased from proclamations, her image removed from coins, her rule reduced to memory. Elizabeth received the news with outward indignation. She declared the act unlawful, insisting that no monarch should be deposed by subjects. Yet beneath her outrage lay calculation. Mary's fall removed the one rival strong enough to challenge her throne. To defend the principle of sovereignty was safe. To defend the woman herself was not. So she wrote letters of concern, dispatched envoys, and waited. History, she had learned, would favor the patient. At Loch Leven, the days bled into one another, sunlight through mist, moonlight upon stone. The Queen kept her dignity as armor. She tended the garden, read from her book of hours, and walked the island's narrow paths beneath the watch of her jailer, Sir William Douglas. Yet she was not without hope. Loyalists beyond the lake plotted her escape, passing secret messages hidden in linen and wax. They swore that her throne could be restored, her enemies scattered, her son reclaimed. Whether she believed them or not, she played the part required of her, the Queen unbroken, the captive who still commanded loyalty. In London, Elizabeth's court debated her cousin's future with care and unease. Some urged compassion, others caution. The Queen herself remained undecided, or appeared to. She could not afford Mary's freedom, but she feared her death. To execute a fellow sovereign would stain not just a conscience but a crown. And yet, to leave her alive was to invite conspiracy from every Catholic prince in Europe. So Elizabeth chose the path she knew best. Delay. We must see what the Scots will do, she told Cecil. And in that sentence lay her genius. Inaction became strategy. Hesitation became rule. By the turning of the year, Scotland had begun to fracture again. The nobles who had risen to defend the infant king quarreled among themselves, and the people, weary of war and rumor, began to murmur for their queen's return. The cause of Mary Stuart, thought extinguished, began to glow faintly in the dark. Her supporters gathered arms. Her friends within the castle made preparations. In the spring of 1568, the impossible happened. On a May night veiled in rain, Mary escaped. Disguised as a laundress, she slipped through an unlocked door, crossed the narrow waters in a small boat, and set foot upon the mainland. The wind that struck her face carried the scent of grass and earth, the breath of freedom. She mounted a waiting horse and rode through the night, the lake receding behind her like a dream too vivid to forget. Word spread through the countryside faster than the dawn. By sunrise, hundreds had joined her. She rode south toward Hamilton, her banner once again unfurled. Her army gathered with astonishing speed, 5,000 men, bound less by loyalty than by legend. They called her their rightful sovereign, the anointed of God betrayed by rebels. Moray, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. On the 11th of May, the two forces met near Glasgow at Langside. The battle lasted less than an hour. Mary's troops fought bravely but without order. Her captains argued even as the charge began. The Queen, watching from a hill, saw her army break and scatter beneath the regent's disciplined assault. When it was over, 500 lay dead, and the rest fled into the woods. Her return to power had lasted 11 days. She rode hard through the night once more, but this time not toward her throne, toward the border. Her companions urged her to turn west to the safety of France, but she refused. "I will go to my cousin of England," she said, "for she will aid me." She believed, or wanted to believe, that Elizabeth's outrage at her deposition would translate into mercy. It was the final misjudgment of a life defined by faith in the wrong hearts. On the 16th of May, 1568, Mary crossed the River Solway and entered England. Her arrival was both flight and surrender. She came not as a queen visiting her equal, but as a fugitive seeking refuge. Yet even in exile, she carried herself as sovereign. At Carlisle Castle, she awaited Elizabeth's reply, confident that her cousin would receive her with the courtesy of one monarch to another. Days turned to weeks. No invitation came. Instead, she was informed that her presence required investigation not as a guest, but as a suspect. Her letters would be examined, her actions questioned, her freedom withheld. Elizabeth, ever the strategist, feigned compassion. "We will not betray her," she said before her council. But in truth, she had no intention of setting her free. Mary's arrival had placed a weapon into her hands, the living embodiment of treason and temptation. Every Catholic lord in England would see in the Scottish Queen a rallying point, every priest a miracle of survival. To protect her was to invite rebellion. To imprison her was to preserve peace. Thus, the woman who had fled captivity now entered a longer, quieter kind of prison, one gilded by courtesy, guarded by law, and destined to last 19 years. As she was moved from castle to castle, Carlisle to Bolton, Bolton to Tutbury, she carried with her the same emblem that had once graced her banner, "En ma défense, Dieu me défend." But the words now seemed hollow. Her chains were invisible yet unbreakable. And in London, Elizabeth slept soundly, knowing that history's balance had shifted once again in her favor. The Queen in chains had crossed into a land where mercy and policy were the same thing. She had sought protection and found judgment. The daughter of destiny had become the prisoner of time. The rain that fell upon northern England that summer was relentless, washing the roads into rivers and the fields into swamps. It seemed as though the heavens themselves sought to remind the exiled queen of her place, a foreigner in a land that would never again let her go. Mary, lodged first in Carlisle, then at Bolton Castle, learned that captivity can wear many faces. The guards were polite, the food sufficient, the quarters respectable. She was called "Your Grace," bowed to, obeyed. But every courtesy carried the sound of a lock turning. Elizabeth's council, divided in opinion, met repeatedly to decide what should be done with their guest. William Cecil urged caution. To free her was to risk rebellion. To execute her was to anger Europe. The Queen listened and said little. "We shall examine the matter," she declared. And in those words lay the essence of her reign, an endless deferral dressed as reason. She ordered an inquiry, not a trial, to determine whether Mary had been complicit in her husband's death. It was a masterpiece of strategy. The investigation would keep her cousin contained, her enemies uncertain, and her own conscience unstained. At Bolton, Mary filled her days with letters. Her handwriting, once bold and graceful, grew tighter with each passing month. She wrote to the King of France, to the Duke of Alva in the Netherlands, to the Pope himself. She reminded them of her lineage, her faith, her suffering. Some letters reached their destination, others did not. The couriers who carried them were often servants of both queens at once, their loyalty traded for coin or safety. Words that were meant to free her instead became threads in the net drawn slowly around her. Elizabeth's envoys arrived to question her, bowing deeply but watching every movement. They spoke of fairness, of investigation, of justice, words that sounded like hope but meant delay. Mary understood their game, yet she had no choice but to play it. She denied guilt, demanded an audience with the English Queen, and reminded them that sovereigns answer only to God. Her requests were acknowledged with deference and ignored with efficiency. She would never meet Elizabeth face to face. Two mirrors cannot stand in the same light without breaking. Meanwhile, the council convened in York, then Westminster, to examine the evidence brought from Scotland. Letters said to be in Mary's own hand, the infamous casket letters. They spoke of love, ambition, and complicity in Darnley's death. Whether forged or genuine, they achieved their purpose. The English commissioners declared the case inconclusive, but the stain of suspicion was permanent. Elizabeth could now justify her cousin's detention not as cruelty, but as caution. The Queen of Scots had become both guest and ghost, a presence too dangerous to release, too royal to destroy. Years in confinement alter the very rhythm of existence. The seasons became her only calendar, the changing of guards her only news. In winter, frost crept across the barred windows like lace. In summer, the scent of roses reached her from gardens she could not enter. She embroidered to pass the time, stitching emblems of her past crowns, thistles, lilies, onto linen that would one day hang in rooms she would never see again. She read the scriptures, wrote poetry, and played the lute in the evenings, her voice soft but steady. Her captors began to fear her less as a queen and more as a legend. Elizabeth, in London, felt the weight of her cousin's captivity not as guilt but as necessity. "There can be no peace," she once told Cecil, "while the Scots queen lives free," and yet she kept her alive. To kill her would have been to invite martyrdom. To keep her close was to hold a weapon against her enemies. The Pope called Elizabeth the heretic Jezebel. Spain muttered of invasion, and the Catholics of England looked north with hope. So long as Mary lived, rebellion had a face, and so long as Elizabeth delayed, her throne remained safe. But delay, like mercy, has its limits. The longer Mary remained in England, the more her presence seeped into its politics. Catholics whispered of her deliverance. Protestants dreamed of her removal. Across the Channel, the courts of Europe watched with fascination. To France, she was a daughter wronged. To Spain, a potential ally. To Rome, a saint in waiting. To Elizabeth, she was a mirror that would not shatter. In 1569, the first tremors of unrest reached the north. The Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, long discontented with Elizabeth's Protestant rule, raised their banners in rebellion. They proclaimed loyalty to the true faith and demanded the restoration of Mary to her throne. The rising was swift and passionate and doomed. Within weeks, Elizabeth's forces crushed it with brutal precision. The rebels were executed, their lands seized, their families ruined. The Queen's vengeance was quiet but absolute. Yet in the aftermath, Mary's fate grew darker. The rebellion had proved what Cecil had always warned. As long as she lived, she would be a beacon to the discontented. Her confinement grew stricter. She was moved south to Tutbury Castle, a fortress cold and damp, surrounded by marsh and mist. Her household was reduced, her letters censored, her visitors screened. The guards who watched her no longer spoke of pity but of duty. She was still addressed as Your Grace, but the words had become hollow courtesies. In her chamber, she kept a single candle burning through the night, a small defiance against the dark. The years began to blend into one another, marked only by illness and rumor. She grew thinner, her once vivid hair streaked with gray. Yet her will remained unbroken. She studied her captors as carefully as they studied her, memorizing their habits, their weaknesses, their sympathies. Where force failed, she used persuasion. Where persuasion failed, patience. A queen who has lost her crown learns to rule in subtler ways. Through letters, gifts, and whispered promises, she rebuilt her network not of soldiers, but of hearts. Elizabeth, sensing the quiet movement of intrigue, began to look for new means of control. From this need arose a new kind of weapon, invisible, relentless, and modern: the art of espionage. Francis Walsingham, a scholar turned statesman, entered her service. To him, the realm was a web, and every whisper a thread. He began to build what would become the most intricate intelligence network in Europe. From London to Paris, from Edinburgh to Rome, his agents listened, watched, and intercepted. And at the center of that web, two women sat, one ruling, one waiting. The Queen in chains, could not know that her greatest enemy had already begun to write her final chapter. Every letter she sent, every prayer she whispered, every alliance she dreamed of would pass through unseen hands. Her captivity was no longer confined to walls of stone. It had become a cage of information. And so, as 1568 turned to 1569, the story of two queens entered a new age, one of ink and cipher, of silence and shadow. The age of the sword had passed. The age of the spy had begun. The year 1569 marked a change not only in England's politics but in the very nature of power itself. The age of armored knights and battlefield banners was fading. In its place rose a quieter empire, one of secrets, cipher, and silence. At its heart stood two queens, one ruling in sunlight, the other plotting in shadow. Elizabeth had learned through experience that kingdoms are not lost to armies but to whispers. Her father had ruled by terror, her sister by faith. She would rule by knowledge. In this conviction, she was guided by Francis Walsingham, a man who understood that fear can be measured in parchment and ink. Born of exile and tempered by faith, Walsingham saw the world not as nations but as networks. Every letter, every merchant, every priest could be a channel of information. He began to weave his web fine as silk, invisible as breath, and stronger than any chain. London, under his direction, became the center of this new empire of intelligence. Taverns filled with spies disguised as travelers. Ships' captains carried messages hidden in barrels of wine. Couriers whispered passwords in markets and churches. The city itself seemed to hum with secrets. Nothing was too small to matter. A coded phrase in a merchant's invoice, a pause in a priest's confession, a ring worn on the wrong hand, all were threads to be pulled. And at the center of every thread lay one name, Mary Stuart. The Scottish queen, now a captive of nearly 2 years, had become both a symbol and a threat. Her imprisonment had transformed her image. To some, she was a fallen sinner. To others, a martyred saint. Among English Catholics, she inspired silent devotion. Her likeness, smuggled in miniatures and rings, passed from hand to hand like a relic. Priests prayed for her deliverance in candlelit secrecy. Even the educated and cautious whispered her name in sympathy, for her story carried the tragedy of lost grandeur. The daughter of kings, the widow of France, the exiled queen, her very existence reminded England of what it had forsaken. Mary understood the power of image as well as Elizabeth did. Denied a throne, she began to rule through imagination. Her letters, written on fragile sheets of paper in her delicate hand, traveled across borders and faiths. She wrote not as a prisoner, but as a monarch in temporary retreat. Each word was measured, each phrase a performance. She promised justice to her allies, forgiveness to her enemies, and divine favor to all. Her pen became her crown, but every letter that left her chamber was read before it arrived. Walsingham's agents intercepted them at ports and abbeys, translated, copied, and resealed them. What she believed to be secret became spectacle. The queen in chains was no longer speaking to her allies, she was performing for her captors. Elizabeth, reading the reports each week, saw in them not threat but reassurance. So long as her cousin continued to hope, she would remain harmless. Hope, after all, is the softest form of prison. Meanwhile, the rebellion in the north had been crushed, but its embers smoldered across Europe. In Rome, Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth, declaring her deposed and freeing her subjects from allegiance. It was a document of theology, but its echo was political thunder. In Spain, Philip II began to weigh invasion. In France, the Guise family, kin to Mary and champions of Catholic power, urged action. The world's great Catholic monarchies saw in the captive Queen of Scots a banner for restoration. To free her would be to redeem Christendom. To kill her would be to martyr it. Elizabeth understood the danger, but refused to yield to fear. She fortified her coastlines, tightened her watch on priests, and deepened her reliance on Walsingham's network. England became a realm of watchers and the watched. Even within her own court, she trusted few. The same subtle brilliance that preserved her throne isolated her heart. Her closest advisors admired her intellect, but pitied her solitude. A crown, they knew, does not protect against loneliness. It perfects it. Mary, meanwhile, was moved once again from Tutbury to Sheffield, then to Chartley. Each relocation was presented as precaution, but it was punishment in disguise. The walls changed, the guards changed, the confinement did not. Yet she adapted with a grace that unsettled her captors. She kept a small household, women loyal through faith, men loyal through memory. Together they formed a tiny court of their own, complete with rituals of ceremony and prayer. Each evening she presided over supper as though still a reigning sovereign. To live as if free was her quietest rebellion. Years passed, and England changed around her. The generation that remembered her coronation began to fade. New poets, new courtiers, new explorers filled the imagination of Elizabeth's subjects. The Queen's own legend, the Virgin Sovereign, Gloriana, began to eclipse the memory of her cousin. Portraits showed her ageless, unyielding, almost divine. Her court poets compared her to the sun, whose light dispels darkness, and whose glance burns traitors to ash. Mary, by contrast, became the moon, beautiful, distant, reflected. Their rivalry was no longer of politics but of myth. The world could hold only one light at a time, yet even the sun fears eclipse. Elizabeth's spies reported new plots, whispers of Spanish fleets, Jesuit missions, and coded correspondence. One name began to reappear in the intercepted letters: Ridolfi, an Italian banker and papal agent. He had woven together a plan to depose Elizabeth and marry Mary to the Duke of Norfolk. The conspiracy was bold but clumsy. Walsingham's network dismantled it before it reached maturity. Norfolk was arrested, tried, and executed. His death sent a chill through every noble house in England. The message was unmistakable. No title, no faith, no blood could protect a traitor. Mary was not directly implicated, yet the shadow of guilt lengthened. Each new plot, whether she knew of it or not, added another layer to her prison. Elizabeth's tolerance, though strategic, began to thin. "We must not tempt fortune," she told Cecil, her tone heavy with exhaustion. Still, she resisted the final step. She would not kill a queen. Not yet. And so the years turned again. The 1,570 seconds unfolded as a decade of vigilance. England prospered, its merchants grew rich, its scholars flourished, its navy expanded. But beneath the peace ran an undercurrent of fear. The Queen's men, Elizabeth's secret messengers, moved through ports and taverns, their ears tuned for treason. In letters, in confessions, in dreams, her subjects betrayed themselves. Walsingham collected everything, a patient spider expanding his web. The more he learned, the less he slept. He once told a colleague that the only secure throne is the one guarded by suspicion. Elizabeth agreed. Mary, in her captivity, aged but did not fade. The once celebrated beauty became a solemn figure of endurance. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, retained the calm of one who has seen her own fate and accepted it. She continued to write, to hope, to imagine escape, but the hope had changed. It was no longer the hope of return, but of redemption. She had become, in her own mind, less a queen than a cause. Her letters spoke not of politics, but of martyrdom. "If God wills me to die," she wrote in one of them, "let my blood be the seed of faith." Those words, intercepted by Walsingham, were read aloud to Elizabeth, who listened without expression. She knew what Mary had not yet realized, that faith, when weaponized, makes death a kind of victory. The decade closed with both women still bound, one by duty, the other by captivity. They had not met, yet their lives had become inseparable. Two sides of the same coin struck by destiny. Between them lay a realm transformed by their rivalry. The sword had given way to the pen, the battlefield to the cipher. the knight to the spy. The war of queens had become the war of silence, and in that silence, the shadow moved closer. By the middle of the 1570 seconds, the air in England had changed. It was quieter, denser, filled with listening. Every letter seemed to carry a second meaning, every silence a warning. The country had learned to live with suspicion as other nations lived with hunger or faith. To serve the queen was to watch, and to survive was to be watched in return. Under Elizabeth's reign, secrecy had become a virtue, and trust a kind of folly. Francis Walsingham ruled this invisible kingdom. His eyes, sharp behind the veil of courtesy, missed nothing. His agents, priests, courtiers, merchants, even servants were scattered across Europe like seeds of iron. Some served willingly, others unknowingly, all relentlessly. In taverns from Antwerp to Venice, his ciphermen intercepted rumors before they grew into rebellion. He paid for information with gold, favors, and sometimes silence. To his queen, he offered not comfort but clarity. "The greatest danger," he wrote in one of his reports, "is the one we think too distant to approach." Elizabeth read his dispatches each morning, her fingers tracing the neat folds of parchment, her eyes moving slowly, coldly, across the words. They brought her the world, whispers from Rome, gossip from the Spanish court, plots unearthed in Paris, threats rising from the sea. Yet among all the tidings of ambition and betrayal, one name appeared again and again, as constant as her own shadow, Mary Stuart. The Queen of Scots had by now spent nearly a decade in captivity. Her name no longer frightened the people, yet it haunted their politics. She lived as a prisoner, but her image walked free across Europe. In Catholic lands, her story was told as a parable of faith betrayed by heresy. Artists painted her not as captive but as saint. Poets compared her to Catherine and Agnes, women who suffered for God's truth. Her suffering became her power. The weaker she seemed, the more dangerous she became. Elizabeth understood the paradox. She could not free her cousin, but she could not let her die. Not yet. A living Mary was a magnet for rebellion, a dead one, a martyr. So the game continued a balance between mercy and menace, preservation and peril. Elizabeth's genius lay in hesitation, and Walsingham's in precision. Together they built a cage so intricate that it appeared merciful. Mary, confined now at Sheffield, watched the years slip by through barred windows. The faces of her attendants changed. The faces of her jailers grew older. Time itself seemed to move differently inside those walls. She embroidered endlessly, her needle tracing verses and symbols into silk. Each design carried secret meanings: crowns broken, phoenixes rising, hearts pierced with swords. They were prayers stitched into fabric, messages written to eternity. Yet her mind remained restless. She had been a queen too long to surrender completely to resignation. Her letters continued, though fewer now reached their destinations. The Spanish ambassador in London, the Duke of Guise in France, even the Pope's legate, all received her pleas for aid and patience. She promised that once freed, she would restore England to the true faith, unite the crowns, and crush heresy forever. But her words fell upon weary ears. The princes of Europe, entangled in their own wars, had learned the cost of challenging Elizabeth's England. The age of crusades was ending. The age of commerce had begun. Faith still moved men's hearts, but gold now guided their hands. Only one man still believed her cause might rise again: Thomas Morgan, a Welsh Catholic exile living in Paris. From his lodgings near the Seine, he began to correspond with her, sending letters hidden in barrels of wine and caskets of fruit. He spoke of friends in London, of noblemen still loyal to Rome, of secret funds from Spain. His tone was fervent, his faith absolute. He became the echo she most wanted to hear. But Morgan's words, like all messages of hope, passed through hands, unseen hands belonging to Walsingham's agents. The web tightened with every reply. The spy network grew darker as the decade neared its end. In cellars across London, Walsingham's cryptographers labored over intercepted letters, their fingers stained with ink and secrecy. They learned to read invisible messages written in citrus juice, to trace meaning through the pattern of folds and creases. They broke ciphers older than empires, exposing conspiracies before the ink was dry. England became the birthplace of modern espionage, an empire of paper that would outlast all others. Elizabeth, the spy queen, wore her knowledge like armor. To the world she appeared radiant, untroubled, almost divine. Her portraits showed her clothed in light, surrounded by symbols of purity and wisdom. Yet those who served her saw the cost behind the serenity. Each plot uncovered, each traitor executed, carved another shadow upon her soul. To rule by fear is to live within it. She often walked alone at night through the gardens of Whitehall, her steps echoing softly against the stones, as though pacing the boundaries of her own conscience. Mary's health began to fail in those years. Her strength ebbed, her hair silvered, but her pride endured. She refused to beg for life, as some captives might. Instead, she spoke through gesture and composure. She insisted that her meals be served with ceremony, that her attendants address her as Majesty. Even her prayers carried the tone of command. It was said by those who saw her that her presence filled a room the way memory fills silence without sound, but entirely. In 1579, the first hint of a new plot reached Walsingham's ears. His agents in France intercepted letters between English Catholic exiles and Mary's supporters. The scheme was still vague, a promise of Spanish gold, a whisper of uprising, a vision of liberation. But to Walsingham, vagueness was not innocence. It was potential. He intensified his surveillance, placing informants within Mary's household, intercepting every letter that passed through her hands. Her world, already small, began to shrink further still. Elizabeth's patience, though vast, had limits. She was 50 by then, her reign secure but her nerves frayed. She ruled a nation that loved her, yet feared her, a court filled with brilliance and deceit. The Queen of England had become both symbol and woman, worshipped and lonely, adored and watched. In the solitude of her chamber, she sometimes touched the ring she wore upon her finger, engraved with her mother's name, and wondered what her own end would be. Perhaps, she thought, all queens are prisoners in the end, some of stone, others of memory. The decade closed as it had begun in silence. The rebellion had been quelled, the conspiracies postponed, the two queens still bound by invisible threads. But under the quiet, something moved. Across the Channel, in the palaces of Spain and the cloisters of France, new plans began to form. England's enemies had grown patient. The next blow would not come from within its walls, but from beyond its seas. And when it came, it would test not only the strength of Elizabeth's spies, but the weight of her soul. For now, though, both women waited the spy and the prisoner, each held by the same invisible hand of destiny. One ruled a kingdom of secrets. The other dreamed of escape. Neither could see that their stories, long entwined, were already turning toward their final meeting, a meeting not of bodies, but of judgments. The web was complete. All that remained was for someone to touch it. The year 1580 arrived like a whisper that grew into a storm. England stood at the edge of greatness and peril. Its ships roamed the world. Its scholars filled the universities. Its queen glowed in portraits like the sun itself. Yet beneath the gold leaf and praise, the air trembled with unease. For Elizabeth's peace had been bought not with harmony, but with vigilance. Her kingdom was an island surrounded not by sea, but by plots. Across the Channel, Spain's power swelled beneath the heavy silence of its king. Philip II had not forgotten the heretic throne that defied Rome. In monasteries and embassies, plans were drawn to bring England back to the Catholic faith, by conversion if possible, by fire if not. Armies assembled, ships were built, and messengers rode through Europe, carrying words of restoration written in cipher and prayer. At the center of these plans, once again, glimmered the same fragile beacon, Mary Stuart. For 19 years, she had lived behind stone walls, a queen in exile, her cause surviving only in letters and dreams. Yet her name still inspired the faithful. Her captors thought time would erase her, but time had only refined her legend. To the exiled priests in Flanders, she was the promise of redemption. To Philip of Spain, the instrument of providence. To the Jesuits, a soul worth the blood of martyrs. And to Elizabeth, she remained the question that refused to die. Francis Walsingham watched it all unfold with the patience of a man who measured history in patterns. His network had grown vast, his methods precise. He intercepted letters between courtiers, merchants, even priests, tracing them through layers of deception until every word had a shadow. He did not trust coincidence, he trusted only evidence. And he knew that one day, inevitably, Mary's hope would drive her into his web. At Chartley Hall, where she was now confined, Mary's world had shrunk to a few rooms in a garden. Her health was failing, but her spirit still burned with the quiet conviction of destiny. She believed that her son, James VI of Scotland, would one day rule both realms, uniting the crowns in peace. Yet she also believed that the crown of England, unjustly denied her, could still be reclaimed through faith and courage. Her mind turned more and more toward deliverance. She wrote letters by candlelight, her script delicate and deliberate, her words filled with longing and resolve. To her, they were prayers sent into darkness. To Walsingham, they were bait. In 1581, a Jesuit priest named Edmund Campion was captured and executed in London. His death marked a turning point. The dream of peaceful conversion was gone. The age of mercy had ended. England's Catholics were now forced into secrecy, their loyalty measured in suspicion. From this desperation grew conspiracy, and from conspiracy, opportunity. Among the young exiles abroad was a man named Anthony Babington, handsome, devout, and easily persuaded by visions of glory. He admired Mary deeply, calling her our rightful queen, and imagined himself her liberator. He gathered around him a circle of idealists and zealots, men who mistook faith for destiny. Together, they began to dream of assassination. Walsingham's agents were already among them. They listened, guided, and recorded. The spy master understood human frailty too well to intervene early. A plot unfinished could not justify a death warrant. He let it grow, nurtured it with whispers and false encouragement, until it bloomed into treason visible even to God. Babington and his companions began corresponding directly with Mary, using a secret courier, a brewer who smuggled letters in the stoppers of beer barrels sent to her residence. The system was ingenious, and it was Walsingham's. Each letter Mary received, she answered with care. She thanked them for their devotion, urged them to patience, and hinted at divine approval for their cause. She believed her words safe within the cipher devised by her secretaries, a code of symbols and numbers too intricate for interception. But Walsingham had already broken it. His cryptographers, led by Thomas Philippus, copied each message the night it arrived, deciphered it, and resealed it before dawn. Mary's most private thoughts were laid bare before her enemies, her hopes transcribed into evidence. The Queen in Chains had become the author of her own destruction. Elizabeth knew nothing of the details. Walsingham shielded her from the ugliness of the work, allowing her conscience to remain unblemished. She ruled by principle. He ruled by necessity. He believed that in a world where kings fell by poison and faith, there could be no purity in power. If we would save England, he once said, we must learn to sin quietly. The Queen, when told only the outcome, nodded in sorrow and silence. Mary's replies grew bolder as months passed. Her loneliness made her reckless. Her faith made her fearless. She wrote that England's Catholics should rise for the deliverance of the realm from heresy, and promised that once Elizabeth was removed, she would restore the true religion and pardon all who served the cause. It was the confession Walsingham had waited for, not shouted, not forced, but written in her own hand. The letter, decoded by Philippus, was sent to his master with a single Latin annotation scribbled in the margin, quod erat demonstrandum, that which was to be proved. Yet even in victory, Walsingham hesitated. To expose the plot was to end it, but to end it was to kill a queen. And to kill a queen was to risk the conscience of another. Elizabeth had long sworn she would never sign such a warrant. She had condemned traitors, rebels, and fools, but never royalty. She ruled by divine right. How could she strike down one who shared it? The moral geometry of power held her captive, as surely as any prison. Still, the evidence gathered weight. The letters, the names, the plans all aligned in dreadful harmony. By 1586, the Babington plot was complete. Its conspirators believed the hour near. They wrote to Mary for final confirmation. Her answer sealed her fate. "When all is ready," she wrote, "then shall it be accomplished." She meant restoration. They meant murder. And Walsingham, reading those words, saw not ambiguity, but guilt. The trap had closed, perfectly, silently. The queen in chains had written her own death sentence. Outside her walls, the world prepared for war. Spain's armada gathered in its ports. Jesuits moved in secrecy through English towns. The Pope blessed banners that would never unfurl. The age of correspondence was about to give way to the age of confrontation. And in a quiet room in Chartley, Mary wrote her last letters of hope, believing herself closer than ever to freedom. Each page she signed was carried away through the garden gate, across the fields, and into the waiting hands of the men who would destroy her. The letters of blood had begun to flow, and with them, history turned its final page toward the axe. By the summer of 1586, the air in England seemed heavy with waiting. The harvest ripened, the churches hummed with prayer, and in the streets of London, rumor moved like wind through wheat. The people knew something was coming, though none could name it. In the darkened chambers of Whitehall, Francis Walsingham sat over his papers, silent and still, as if holding the pulse of the realm beneath his hand. The web he had woven for years now trembled with a single vibration. The proof he had sought was complete. Anthony Babington and his circle still dreamed of liberation. They met in gardens and cellars, whispering of deliverance and destiny. They believed their plan hidden from mortal eyes. They had written to Mary of Scotland, received her blessing, and saw themselves as chosen instruments of God. They did not know that their every meeting was known, their every letter copied, their every movement traced. Even as they prayed for success, Walsingham's agents waited beyond the door. The world's first modern intelligence operation had reached its perfect form, invisible, total, merciless. When the arrests came, they came swiftly. On an August morning, Babington was seized in a farmhouse near St. John's Wood. His companions were taken within hours. The letters were gathered, the ciphers catalogued, the confessions prepared. England had learned to turn treason into procedure. The men were tried in Westminster Hall, condemned for conspiring to compass the death of Her Majesty the Queen. They were executed publicly, their deaths meant as both warning and ritual. The spectators cheered, but among the crowd lingered a tremor of pity. The nation was beginning to understand that every rebellion, however futile, left behind a scar. Walsingham presented his evidence to the council with the calm of inevitability. Each document was arranged in careful order: the intercepted letters, the deciphered codes, the confession signed by trembling hands. At the center lay one piece of paper, a copy of Mary's own letter, written in her elegant French hand, confirming the plan. It was not the work of imagination or rumor. It was her writing, her seal, her words. No more denials, no more appeals. She had been judged by her own pen. Elizabeth received the news in silence. She took the letter and read it alone by candlelight. Her face, always disciplined, revealed nothing. To those outside the chamber, she seemed untouched, but within her, something shifted. She had always believed that she and Mary were bound by destiny, two halves of the same inheritance, one chosen, one cast aside. Now, for the first time, she faced the knowledge that one must die for the other to live. It was not triumph she felt, but exhaustion. The logic of power had demanded its final offering. Mary was moved from Chartley to Fotheringhay Castle, a fortress of stone rising above the grey fields of Northamptonshire. There she was greeted not by soldiers, but by commissioners of state. They bowed with ceremony, and informed her that she was to stand trial for treason against the Queen of England. She laughed, not from mirth but disbelief. "I am a sovereign," she said, "and no subject can judge me." But there was no court in Europe that would hear her plea. The age of chivalry had ended. The age of bureaucracy had begun. The trial opened on the 14th of October. It was less a contest of argument than a ceremony of judgment. The evidence was overwhelming, the verdict predetermined. Yet even her enemies were struck by her composure. She entered the hall dressed in black, her bearing regal, her tone measured. When the accusations were read, she denied none of the letters, only their intent. She spoke of her long captivity, of her right to seek deliverance, of her conscience as a queen. Her words fell upon a silence too deep for mercy. She was condemned unanimously. The commissioners signed the judgment, and history signed with them. Elizabeth delayed. Weeks passed. The warrant remained unsigned. She questioned her counselors, sought divine guidance, and withdrew into solitude. To her, the act was not political but sacramental. To kill Mary was to disturb the very order of kingship, to draw blood from a body that claimed divine immunity. And yet to spare her was to invite invasion, rebellion, perhaps the ruin of England itself. No choice was clean. In that torment lay the essence of her reign, the burden of decision born in isolation. Walsingham pressed her gently, reminding her that hesitation endangered the crown. Cecil argued duty. Parliament cried for justice. None of them could comprehend the shadow that stood before her. To them, Mary was a problem to be solved. To Elizabeth, she was a reflection of her own mortality. Two queens, one crown, one fate. The same blood that demanded vengeance demanded compassion. The act that would save her kingdom would also stain her soul. As winter deepened, the pressure grew unbearable. Every morning the council presented the warrant. Every evening she set it aside. The document lay upon her desk like a living thing, patient, accusing, inevitable. At last, on the 1st of February, 1587, Elizabeth took up her pen. Her hand trembled. She signed her name in the long, graceful script of monarchs. For a moment, she stared at the ink as though it were blood. Then she turned away. The warrant left the palace without her direct command. Whether through zeal or calculation, her ministers sent it to Fotheringhay. The machinery of justice had begun to move, slow and unstoppable. Elizabeth could not call it back. She had crossed from hesitation to history. Mary received the news calmly. She had waited 19 years for deliverance. Now it had come, though not as she had imagined. Her final letters were written not in code but in faith. She forgave her enemies, blessed her son, and commended her soul to God. She asked that her servants be treated kindly, that her body be buried in consecrated ground, and that the world remember her not as traitor, but as queen. In her last hours, she found a peace that had eluded her for decades. It was not the peace of victory, but of surrender, a surrender that outlasts conquerors. In London, Elizabeth received word of what had been done. She wept, or was said to have wept, though no one dared witness it. She blamed her ministers, cursed the haste, and shut herself away from the court. For days she spoke to no one. The act she had avoided for years had now defined her forever. Power, once again, had demanded a price only a queen could pay. The letters that had condemned Mary were gathered into archives, bound in velvet, and sealed by law. They were called evidence. History would call them prophecy. For in them, The age of correspondence had reached its terrible perfection. Words had become weapons, ink had become blood, and the pen had proved sharper than the sword. The two queens would never meet, yet their fates had finally touched. One would die, and the other would live haunted. And in that balance of mercy and necessity, England entered its most haunted hour. Dawn came slowly to Fotheringhay. The sky was pale with frost, and the air hung still above the fields. Inside the castle, torches burned low, their smoke rising in thin blue threads. The great hall had been prepared through the night, a scaffold raised, draped in black cloth, and ringed by soldiers who spoke in hushed tones. They were men trained for order, not for conscience, yet even they felt the weight of what was to come. Before the day was done, a queen would die upon English soil. Mary Stuart rose before sunrise. She had slept little, though sleep had long ceased to matter. Her women dressed her in crimson velvet, the color of martyrdom, and placed a small gold crucifix upon her breast. She had requested that the executioner be paid in gold, that her servants be allowed to depart unharmed, and that no one touch her body until her soul had gone. Such details gave structure to the end, as ceremony gives meaning to despair. In her chamber she prayed quietly, the words half whispered in French and Latin, a language between her and eternity. She had lived by letters, plots, and uncertain hopes. Now all that remained was faith. Beyond the walls, the crowd gathered, summoned by curiosity more than reverence. They had come to witness the fall of a queen, not out of hatred, but to see history turn before their eyes. At 9 o'clock, the sheriff entered. His voice, practiced and distant, announced that the hour had come. Mary nodded once. Her ladies wept openly. She comforted them with gestures of calm command. Together they walked the narrow passage to the hall, the sound of footsteps echoing like a slow drum. The chill of February seeped through the stones. The scaffold waited beneath the vaulted roof, surrounded by nobles, officials, and guards. Above them, a few beams of winter light cut through the high windows, pale and merciless. Mary ascended the steps without hesitation. She stood upon the platform as though it were a throne. Her bearing was serene, not defiant, not afraid. To those who watched, it seemed as if she had already passed beyond the reach of earthly judgment. The warrant was read aloud, the words heavy and formal. Mary, late Queen of Scots, convicted of treason against Her Majesty Elizabeth, Queen of England. Each syllable fell into the stillness, like the tolling of a bell. There were no cries, no interruptions. The law was performing its final act. When the reading ended, Mary removed her cloak herself and laid her crucifix upon the block. The executioner knelt, asking forgiveness. She gave it freely. 2 blows ended her life. The first struck bone. The second found the heart's quiet. For a moment there was no sound, only the strange stillness that follows an irreversible act. Then the priest murmured a prayer. The officials bowed, and the assembly dispersed, each carrying away the image they would never forget. The body was covered in linen, the head placed beside it. Thus ended Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, daughter of a dynasty, victim of a century that had learned to make faith political. In London, the news traveled faster than remorse. Couriers galloped through the night, their torches marking a chain of flame between the 2 queens. When the message reached Whitehall, Elizabeth was walking in her privy garden. She saw the messenger before she heard his words. One look at his face told her everything. The world seemed to grow silent, as if sound itself recoiled. She did not faint, nor cry out. Instead, she turned away, her hand gripping the railing until the knuckles whitened. The act had been done in her name, yet without her consent or so she would insist, again and again. Her counselors had crossed the line she could not bear to cross herself. They had made her sovereign will into an executioner's deed. In the following hours, she raged with a fury that terrified even those closest to her. She accused them of betrayal, dismissed secretaries, imprisoned courtiers, and demanded the impossible, that the dead be restored. But when the anger passed, there remained only silence. She had long ruled by balance, holding the nation between war and peace, between Catholic and Protestant, between her heart and her crown. Now the balance had broken. She had preserved England, yet lost something invisible within herself. The price of survival was written not in gold or blood, but in solitude. Mary's body was buried at Peterborough Cathedral under guard. No ceremony, no procession, only the quiet closure of stone upon stone. Yet even there, her presence refused to vanish. Pilgrims came in secret, leaving flowers and whispered prayers. In time, poets would call her saint, martyr, and victim. Politicians would call her conspirator and traitor. The truth lay somewhere in the silence between. Elizabeth tried to move forward. She resumed councils, signed decrees, appeared before Parliament. The mask of majesty remained flawless, but those who watched her closely saw the shadow behind her eyes. She had always ruled through restraint, denying herself the ordinary comforts of life, marriage, children, companionship for the sake of the crown. Now, with Mary gone, she began to understand what that sacrifice truly meant. The woman within the monarch had grown thin, almost transparent, until only the emblem remained. Outside her court, England prospered. Trade expanded. Poets wrote of glory. Explorers sailed for distant shores. Yet within the palace, the atmosphere changed. The corridors seemed longer, the rooms colder. The music of the Virgin Queen had acquired a minor key. To many, she appeared untouched by guilt. To herself, she was never free of it. The execution that secured her throne had also marked the beginning of its decline. That spring, she ordered the warrant and all related papers to be sealed in the state archives. "Let them sleep," she said, though no one dared ask whether she meant the documents or her conscience. History would later open those seals, reading in their lines the anatomy of tragedy, a tragedy not of villains and heroes, but of necessity. 2 women born to rule had been placed upon a board too small for both. The world had chosen its survivor. As the year waned, Elizabeth withdrew further into ceremony and solitude. Her portraits from this period show her radiant, unaging, enshrined in jewels, the image of divinity triumphant. Yet beneath that radiance, the cost of rule had already been paid. The axe that fell at Fotheringhay had struck not only Mary's neck, but the last illusion of innocence that monarchy could hold. In the stillness of her chambers, Elizabeth kept one object from the affair: a small gold crucifix, said to have been among Mary's possessions. She never spoke of it, but it remained upon her table until her death. Perhaps it reminded her of mercy. Perhaps it reminded her that no crown rests easy upon mortal hands. The realm moved on. History, as always, obeyed its own momentum. Yet for those who lived through that February morning, the memory never faded: the red velvet, the sound of the axe, the hush that followed. It was the silence of power fulfilled and of humanity surrendered. In that silence, England was reborn and forever haunted. Europe received the news as if a fault line had opened beneath the old order. The execution of a crowned queen was no ordinary act. It was a wound upon the idea of monarchy itself. In Paris, bells tolled not for mourning but for fury. In Madrid, courtiers whispered of divine vengeance. The Pope declared that Elizabeth had unloosed herself from the grace of God. Across the continent, portraits of the Virgin Queen darkened into effigies of heresy. Even those who despised Mary's politics now spoke of her as martyr. The age of religious war was not finished. It had merely found a new banner. Philip of Spain had waited years for a cause that would unite his empire against England. Now it had come. The death of Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic anointed, was taken as a summons from heaven. His fleet, long in preparation, would sail under the sign of retribution. He named it the Armada Invincible. Priests blessed the ships. Soldiers crossed themselves. Europe prepared to punish a heretic queen. In London, Elizabeth knew the tide was turning. The letters from her ambassadors spoke of alliances hardening. of rumors that rolled across Europe like thunder before the storm. Yet she did not yield to fear. She had lived all her life in danger, daughter of Anne Boleyn, survivor of her father's wrath, prisoner under Mary Tudor, and queen beset by plots. She had learned that the crown was not protection but exposure, the point of every weapon. And so she moved through the crisis with a composure that defied comprehension. Still, the shadow of Fotheringhay followed her everywhere. Courtiers found her withdrawn, quick to anger, slow to trust. The death she had not ordered but could not undo had entered her dreams. Some nights she walked the gallery alone, her footsteps echoing against marble and memory. Her ladies-in-waiting spoke softly of an unease that hung in the air, a stillness before some great reckoning. To them, the queen seemed at once indomitable and hallowed, like a monument built from the ashes of its own foundation. In council, she spoke of defense. England's harbors filled with new ships. Watchtowers rose along the southern coast. Drake and Hawkins were called to prepare the fleet. Yet even as she planned for war, her thoughts returned to Mary not as rival but as mirror. The execution had ended one danger but awakened another. The knowledge that power could consume itself. For years she had ruled as the living symbol of restraint, the monarch who would not marry, would not yield, would not stain her reign with blood. Now, in the eyes of the world, she was both virgin and destroyer. Spring turned to summer. The court moved between palaces, following ritual and weather, but its heart had grown still. The poets continued to praise the Queen of Glory. The painters continued to depict her radiant and untouchable. Yet behind the perfection of those images lay the same quiet fatigue that shadowed her days. The crown had become her armor and her cage. In July, the Spanish Armada entered the Channel. Its sails rose like a wall upon the sea, the might of empire drawn against a single island. Elizabeth rode to Tilbury to meet her troops. The scene would become legend. The queen in silver breastplate, mounted upon a white horse, speaking words that history would remember even when none could swear they had been spoken. She had the heart and stomach of a king, she said, and of a king of England, too. The men cheered. The nation believed. Yet beneath the splendor of that hour lay another truth. She had come to face what her conscience could not. The power that had taken a queen's life must now defend its own. The battle was less a clash of chivalry than of wind and providence. Storms scattered the Spanish fleet. English fire ships drove them into chaos. The sea itself chose the victor. When the news of triumph reached London, the bells rang as if the kingdom had been reborn. Elizabeth stood before her council, serene and radiant, the savior of Protestant Europe. Yet within her there stirred no triumph, only relief so deep it resembled grief. She had won not through conquest, but through survival. England was safe. Her soul remained uncertain. Mary's name was spoken again, not in anger but in strange reverence. The woman whose death had summoned an empire now seemed to hover like a ghost above its ruin. In defeating Spain, Elizabeth had silenced every accusation of weakness. Yet the echo of that February morning endured. She had preserved her crown at the cost of her peace. The two queens, divided by faith and policy, were now joined by history, one dead for treason, one living for consequence. In the quiet that followed victory, Elizabeth retreated further into solitude. The courtiers, who once sought her favor, found her distant. Music, once her greatest joy, became rare in the palace. She spoke less of the future and more of the past of her father, her sister, her lost youth. To the world, she appeared eternal. To herself, she felt time pressing at the edges of her reign. The portraitists continued to paint her in symbols: the phoenix, the globe, the sun, but they could not paint the weariness in her eyes. Fotheringhay faded from public memory, as all tragedies do when folded into legend. Yet for Elizabeth, it never faded. Each anniversary brought with it a silence more profound than prayer. The warrant, sealed in its velvet binding, lay in the state chest untouched, yet never forgotten. She had signed it with a mortal hand, but it had written itself upon her eternity. By the end of 1587, England stood stronger than ever. Its queen was adored, its enemies broken, its poets inspired. Yet in the stillness of her private chambers, Elizabeth would sometimes stand before the mirror and see, not the virgin queen, but the woman who had once been Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child who had learned too early that love and death often wear the same crown. History would remember her as triumphant. It would paint her reign in gold, her speech in marble, her legacy in empire. But beneath that legend lingered the faint outline of another story, of two women bound by the same destiny, whose rivalry had reshaped the conscience of a nation. The axe had fallen at Fotheringhay, yet its echo continued in the silence that followed, the silence that filled the rest of Elizabeth's reign. In that silence, England grew into itself, brave, proud, and haunted. The Virgin Queen had conquered her enemies, but she would never conquer her own memory. Power had granted her immortality, but not peace. The age that began with her coronation now drifted toward twilight, and the shadow of the crown stretched long across the dying century. The years after victory unfolded like a long, fading light. England, delivered from invasion, entered its season of splendor. The ships that had defended her shores now sailed toward distant worlds. Trade blossomed, poetry flourished. The court glittered with ambition and art. To the watching nations, Elizabeth's realm seemed eternal, a golden island crowned by the wisdom of a single woman. Yet within that brilliance moved a slow shadow, imperceptible at first, then deepening with every year. Elizabeth had outlived nearly all who had known her youth. Her council grew old, their hair whitening like parchment around her throne. Walsingham had died exhausted by service. Leicester, the companion of her early reign, had followed him to the grave. Even Cecil, who had guided her since the beginning, moved now with the hesitation of age. The court, once alive with rivalry and wit, grew formal and airless. New faces came and went, but none could reach her heart. Power, once exhilarating, had turned to solitude. She ruled still with the same precision, every decree measured, every gesture deliberate, yet something within her had begun to still. The Virgin Queen had become a figure more symbol than sovereign, an icon of endurance rather than desire. The people adored her as one adores a star, distant, untouchable, necessary. But she, who had lived for the gaze of her subjects, began to feel the cost of that perfection. Majesty had become her only language, and there was no one left who spoke it. The poets of her time sang of her glory, Spenser's fairy queen, Shakespeare's heroines who bore her reflection. Their words wrapped her in myth, while gently stealing her humanity. She became an idea, chastity, constancy, England itself. Yet in the long evenings at Richmond or Hampton Court, when the candles burned low and the music faltered, the myth grew heavy. She would sit motionless, listening to the soft tick of the clock, as if waiting for something she could no longer name. The shadow of Mary Stuart never left her. It was not guilt that haunted her, but recognition. She had lived long enough to see her cousin's son, James of Scotland, grow into the man who would inherit her crown. The wheel of fate had turned full circle. The blood she had condemned would continue her line. What had begun as rivalry had become succession. History, indifferent and exact, had written its own reconciliation. Sometimes she would speak of him, cautiously, almost tenderly. "The boy has his mother's wit," she said once, and then fell silent. It was as close to absolution as she would ever offer. In those moments, her reign seemed less a triumph than a vigil, a long watch over the survival of a nation purchased by the solitude of its queen. As the century waned, her body began to betray her. The courtiers still bowed before the glittering mask of paint and jewels, but beneath the lace and velvet her frame had grown frail. The mirror, once her ally, became her adversary. She ordered the windows darkened, the tapestries drawn. She who had once embodied the sun now sought the mercy of shadow. The court moved carefully around her, afraid of the silence that followed every question. Even her laughter, when it came, sounded like an echo remembered from another life. England, too, seemed to hold its breath. The generation that had known her glory was passing. The new century gathered beyond the horizon a world of merchants, scholars, and kings who would speak not of her but of empire. Yet even they sensed that something irreplaceable was ending. The Virgin Queen was not merely a ruler but a symbol of what it meant to stand between eras, the last of the old world, the first of the new. In the winter of 1602, she took to her bed at Richmond Palace. The courtiers spoke in whispers, uncertain whether they stood in the presence of life or legend. For days she refused food, speech, and counsel. She lay upon cushions beneath a canopy embroidered with suns and roses, emblems of a youth she could no longer summon. When her ministers begged her to name a successor, she raised a thin hand and traced the letters of a single name, James. It was her final act of state, the quiet surrender of one queen's crown to another's blood. On the morning of the 24th of March, 1603, the candle at her bedside guttered and went out. Outside, the river ran cold beneath a sky of silver mist. Bells tolled across London not for rebellion, not for victory, but for the end of an age. After 45 years upon the throne, Elizabeth Tudor had entered the only realm no monarch commands. They buried her in Westminster Abbey, beside her sister Mary Tudor, beneath a single monument that declared consorts in name and blood, sisters in faith and rest. Yet in time, another queen would come to join her, Mary Stuart, reinterred by her son with full honors in the same royal vault. The two women who had never met in life now lay together in death, their rivalry dissolved into the stillness of stone. Above them, the abbey bells continued their slow measure, as if tolling the reconciliation of England with itself. In that shared silence lay the meaning of their story. Two queens, born of the same blood, divided by faith and fortune, had together shaped the conscience of a nation. One had ruled by survival, the other by surrender. Between them they defined the boundaries of mercy and power. Their shadows would stretch across every throne that followed, reminding rulers that sovereignty is never without sorrow, and that crowns, once taken up, can never truly be laid down. The age they had created did not end with them. It flowed onward into ships, empires, languages, and legends carrying their echoes like a hidden tide. The Virgin Queen became an emblem of majesty, the Queen of Scots, an emblem of martyrdom. Together they formed the two halves of England's soul, reason and passion, restraint and belief, justice and grace. Every century that followed would rediscover them in its own reflection. And so the story closes as it began, with two daughters of destiny, bound by inheritance and undone by it. The world remembers their names, not for the wars they fought or the policies they signed, but for the mystery they embodied, that power is never free, and that history, in the end, is written not in triumph but in endurance. The crown passed on, but its shadow remained. It lies still upon the marble of Westminster, where two queens sleep side by side, their silence deeper than forgiveness, their peace more lasting than victory. The empire they dreamed, and the conscience they defined, would carry their memory through the centuries until the names Mary and Elizabeth ceased to be history and became fate itself. The winter after Fotheringhay seemed endless. The bells tolled no longer for victory, nor for mourning, but for the slow passage of time itself. England had survived, that was all anyone could say. The storm had passed, yet the silence it left behind was heavier than thunder. In that silence, Elizabeth moved through her palaces like a figure of marble, remote and luminous, her crown gleaming but her heart turned to ash. The world called her triumphant. She felt only hollow, for every triumph had taken something from her, her youth, her peace, her kin. She had outlived them all. Mary, Dudley, Walsingham, Cecil, ghosts who had built the walls around her throne. Now she ruled a nation of poets and sailors, of dreamers and spies, Yet she herself had become a relic of her own legend. The crown had endured, but the woman beneath it had vanished into myth. Across the sea, in Catholic lands, prayers rose for the soul of the murdered queen. In England, sermons thundered praise for the Virgin Queen, who had saved her realm. Between those two voices lay the truth that both women had been prisoners of the same destiny, divided by faith, bound by blood, and undone by history. Their struggle had forged a new world, but neither lived to see it. As the century faded, Elizabeth would stand often at her window, watching the light fall across the river. She would remember the letter that condemned Mary, the signature that had sealed her own solitude, and the silence that followed. The wind carried no answer, only the whisper of her own name, mingled with the one she could never forget. And so the story of two queens became the story of England itself. Power wrested from blood, mercy from ruin, faith from fire. The age had been written not in gold nor glory, but in letters of blood, and in the shadow of those letters, the modern world began to breathe. If you've journeyed with us through the storm and silence of their fate, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more voices of history may rise again from the dust of time.